Chapter 57. The remaining months of Ryanair's pregnancy passed with a quality of anticipation that settled over the entire fortress, not merely Issei and Ryanair's private joy, but something the whole community seemed to carry collectively, a shared, patient waiting that reminded Issei, more than once, of the particular hush that had once settled over the fortress in the days before Gregory's formal recognition finally arrived years earlier. Asia's careful oversight of Ryanair's care proved, across those months, considerably more thorough than either Issei or Ryanair had initially anticipated, the young healer drawing on both her own considerable natural talent and an expanding knowledge base built from careful study alongside scholars from all three factions who had, over recent years, begun contributing their own specialized knowledge to the fortress's growing library. "I want you to understand something," Asia told Ryanair during one of their regular sessions, several months into the pregnancy. As Issei sat nearby watching with the particular attentive worry that had become, he privately admitted, a fairly constant companion since the joyful news first arrived. Fallen angel and devil heritage combining in a single child is not entirely without precedent, but it is rare enough that I want to monitor this pregnancy more carefully than I might a more conventional case. Not because I anticipate serious complications. Simply because careful attention now means considerably less worry later. Ryanair, who had grown increasingly comfortable with Asia's steady, thorough guidance across the preceding months, nodded with genuine trust. "I would not want anyone else overseeing this," she said. "You have proven, across every session, exactly the kind of care I hoped our child would receive." Issei felt the familiar warmth of gratitude settle through him at the exchange, reflecting, not for the first time, on how completely Asia had transformed since her uncertain return to the fortress years earlier, the guilt that had once defined her presence giving way entirely to the confident, capable healer and watch member she had steadily become. The wider sovereignty's response to the approaching birth carried its own considerable weight, representatives from all three allied factions sending gifts and well wishes as word spread through diplomatic channels that had, across 7 years, grown considerably warmer than the cautious, careful communications of the sovereignty's earliest days. Surzex himself sent, along with his personal congratulations, a small collection of protective wards drawn from ancient Gremory family tradition, a gesture that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying weight considerably beyond simple diplomatic courtesy. "Tell him I am not obligating my child to any Gremory tradition by accepting this," Issei told Azazel, who had personally delivered the gift alongside his own considerably more practical present of several carefully selected texts on managing a sacred gear inheritance, a subject Azazel noted, with characteristic dry humor, that Issei's own child stood a reasonable chance of eventually needing to understand firsthand. "Surzex understands that completely," Azazel assured him. He offered it simply as one father figure to another, without any expectation beyond genuine goodwill. "I believe, if I am reading him correctly after all these years, he sees in your approaching fatherhood something considerably more personal than simple diplomatic courtesy. He has spoken, more than once in recent months, of wishing he had built something similar with his own children, before the weight of underworld politics claimed so much of his attention across his very long life." Chapter 58. The child arrived on a quiet spring morning, considerably earlier than the fortress's collective anticipation had prepared for, Ryanair's labor beginning suddenly in the deep hours before dawn and progressing, under Asia's careful, steady guidance, with a swiftness that left Issei simultaneously terrified and profoundly grateful by the time the first cries of new life finally echoed through their quarters. Donasik, keeping careful watch outside their quarters throughout the tense, uncertain hours, later admitted he had never felt so genuinely helpless in all his considerable years of navigating dangerous, uncertain situations, pacing the corridor with the same restless energy he might once have brought to defending the fortress against genuine armed threat, though this particular vigil demanded nothing of him beyond patient, worried waiting. "A daughter," Asia announced, carefully wrapping the newborn in soft cloth before placing her gently into Ryanair's waiting arms, exhaustion and profound joy mingling clearly across the new mother's features. Healthy, strong, and already, if her lungs are any indication, considerably more vocal than either of her parents typically managed to be. Issei felt tears he made no effort to hide as he settled beside Ryanair, gazing down at his daughter for the first time, small storm-colored wings, delicate and still folded close against her back, already visible beneath the soft wrapping, a clear inheritance from her mother that filled Issei with a fierce, overwhelming tenderness he had not fully anticipated even across months of careful preparation. "She is perfect," he said softly, reaching out to gently touch his daughter's small hand, watching her tiny fingers curl instinctively around his own. Ryanair, exhaustion evident but her expression radiant with quiet, unguarded joy, looked up at him with eyes still bright with tears of her own. "What shall we name her?" she asked softly. "We spent months discussing possibilities and never quite settled on the one that felt right." Issei considered the question carefully, watching his daughter's small, peaceful face, and found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of the ancient fortress that had first opened its gates for him 7 years earlier, of the patient, 3,000-year wait that had finally ended the night he first walked through its doors, of everything that patient waiting had ultimately grown to become. "Vesper," he said slowly, testing the weight of the name. It felt fitting somehow, connecting to the same quiet, patient twilight that had defined so much of their remarkable journey together, and to the hope that had grown, steadily and unmistakably, from that same twilight's patient darkness. Ryanair's smile, warm and genuine, confirmed the choice without need for further discussion. "Vesper," she repeated softly, gazing down at their daughter with profound tenderness. "Welcome to the world, little one. You have no idea yet how much love is already waiting for you here." Word of Vesper's birth spread through the fortress within hours, and the celebration that followed, considerably more subdued than the wedding's grand festivities out of respect for Ryanair's need for rest and recovery, nonetheless carried a warmth that Issei found himself treasuring deeply. Representatives from every corner of the sovereignty's diverse community stopping by quietly throughout the following days to offer their own quiet congratulations and small, thoughtful gifts. Kale arrived with a small, carefully carved wooden dragon, explaining, somewhat sheepishly, that he had spent several evenings over recent weeks working on it in quiet anticipation, uncertain whether the timing would prove right but wanting to have something prepared regardless. Elena brought a simple, handwritten collection of blessings drawn from traditions across all 3 factions, carefully selected and translated to honor Vesper's mixed heritage without privileging any single faction's particular customs over the others. Drake, whose ancient presence had remained unusually quiet throughout the actual birth itself, finally spoke as Issei sat alone that evening, Vesper sleeping peacefully in his arms while Ryanair finally rested after the day's considerable exertion. "I have witnessed considerable history across my very long existence, partner," the dragon said quietly, warmth evident even through his characteristic ancient gravity. "Wars, and empires, and the slow, patient rise and fall of entire civilizations. I do not believe I have ever witnessed anything quite so remarkable as this moment, though. New life, born not into fear or obligation, but into a family and a community that has already chosen, unconditionally, to love her completely. She will grow up surrounded by everything we built to protect people like her," Issei said softly, gazing down at his sleeping daughter with profound, quiet wonder. "She will never know what it means to stand alone in a silent room, wondering if anyone will speak up for her." "No," Drake agreed. "She will simply know, from her very first breath, exactly what unconditional belonging feels like. That is no small gift, partner, in a world that has spent centuries teaching people otherwise." Chapter 59. Vesper's first months brought a quality of quiet, domestic joy to Issei and Ryanair's lives that neither of them, across 7 years of crisis and careful building, had fully anticipated experiencing, though the wider work of maintaining and expanding the sovereignty continued steadily alongside their new responsibilities as parents, a balance that both of them navigated with the same patient, collaborative care that had defined their entire partnership. It was during this period, as Vesper approached her 6th month, that the first genuine test of the wider sovereignty network's resilience arrived, not from the remnant's continued patient threat, but from within one of the newly founded independent communities itself, a crisis that Kale brought to the Central Council's attention with evident concern. The Eastern Settlement, the newest of the 4 independent sovereignties founded over the preceding year, has reported significant internal conflict, he explained, spreading a report across the war chamber table with visible unease. Their council has fractured over a leadership dispute, two factions within their own community each claiming legitimate authority, and reports suggest the disagreement has begun escalating toward open confrontation between residents who once considered themselves united under shared founding principles. Issei felt the particular weight of this news settle heavier than he had anticipated, understanding immediately the stakes involved considerably beyond the immediate crisis itself. If this fractures into open conflict, he said slowly, it will not simply damage that single community. It will call into question whether our entire model, communities built on freely chosen loyalty rather than inherited structure, can actually sustain itself without the kind of direct, personal oversight this central fortress has always provided. Elena, studying the report with careful attention, offered a perspective that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying considerable wisdom born from her own years of navigating institutional conflict within the Church before her exile. We cannot simply send our own forces to resolve this through direct intervention, she cautioned. Doing so would undermine the very principle we hoped these independent communities would embody, that they belong fully to their own residents, answerable to their own choices rather than to our continued authority. If we resolve this crisis for them, we prove, inadvertently, that our model only functions under our direct control, precisely the opposite of what we hope to demonstrate. Then what do you propose? Ryanair asked. Vesper settled comfortably in her arms even as the council session's serious business continued around them. We offer guidance, not resolution, Elena said. We send experienced mediators, drawn from our own community's considerable experience with exactly this kind of internal conflict, the same conflict our own council structure was originally designed to prevent. But we insist, from the outset, that the Eastern Settlement's own residents make the final decisions about how their community moves forward. We support their process. We do not replace it. Issei considered this carefully, recognizing in Elena's proposal the same fundamental principle that had guided every significant decision across 7 years of the sovereignty's patient, careful growth. Then that is what we offer, he said. Elena, I would like you to lead the mediation effort personally. You understand institutional conflict and reconciliation more deeply than almost anyone within our community, born from your own difficult experience within the Church before you found your way to these gates. I would be honored, Elena said, though her expression carried the particular weight of someone who understood, fully, exactly how challenging the coming weeks would prove. The mediation effort, launched within days of the Council's decision, tested the wider sovereignty network's resilience in ways that Issei understood, even as Elena departed for the Eastern Settlement, would likely define whether their broader vision, communities built on shared principles but genuinely independent from central authority, could truly sustain itself across the years still ahead. Chapter 60. Elena's mediation effort, unfolding over nearly a month of careful, patient work within the Eastern Settlement, revealed a conflict considerably more nuanced than the initial reports had suggested, not simply a straightforward power struggle between rival leaders, but a genuine, if painful, disagreement about how strictly the young community should adhere to the founding principles they had inherited from the central fortress versus how much freedom they should claim to adapt those principles to their own particular circumstances. I understand both sides completely, Elena reported back to the Central Council partway through her mediation efforts, her voice carrying through the crystal array with evident exhaustion but also genuine, cautious hope. One faction believes strict adherence to everything we taught them during the settlement's founding represents the safest path forward, a proven structure they trust precisely because it worked so well for us. The other faction believes their community's particular circumstances, considerably different from our own fortress's history, require genuine adaptation, and that treating our original principles as rigid doctrine rather than living, evolving values betrays the very spirit those principles were meant to embody. Issei listened carefully, recognizing in the description an echo of tensions that felt, in some ways, remarkably similar to challenges the sovereignty itself had navigated across 7 years of its own patient evolution. What do you believe the resolution should look like? He asked. I do not believe it is my place to decide that resolution, Elena said carefully. That is precisely the principle we are trying to protect here. But I can tell you what I have observed, watching both factions argue their case with genuine passion and genuine care for their community's well-being. Neither side is wrong, exactly. They are simply each holding tightly to one half of the same fundamental truth that has always defined our own sovereignty's success, that principles matter enormously, and that those principles must remain living and adaptable enough to serve the actual people they were built to protect, rather than becoming rigid doctrine divorced from genuine human need. The eventual resolution, reached after several more weeks of careful, facilitated discussion, emerged not through Elena's direct intervention, but through the Eastern settlement's own residents gradually finding common ground. A structure that preserved the core principles of freely chosen loyalty and genuine accountability while allowing considerable flexibility in how those principles translated into their community's particular daily practice. We did not resolve this by choosing one side over the other, the Eastern settlement's newly reconciled council explained, during a formal report delivered to the central fortress once the crisis had finally settled. We resolved it by remembering that the principles themselves were never meant to be static. They were meant to grow and adapt, the same way your own sovereignty grew and adapted across 7 years of careful, patient evolution. We simply needed to rediscover that truth for ourselves, rather than treating what you taught us as fixed doctrine rather than living values. Issei felt profound relief and genuine pride settle through him at the report's conclusion, understanding, with quiet gratitude, that the crisis had ultimately proven something considerably more valuable than a single conflict resolved, genuine confirmation that the wider sovereignty network could indeed sustain itself through its own internal wisdom, rather than requiring constant, direct oversight from the central fortress. This is exactly what we hope to prove, Rias observed, as the council session concluded, Vesper now nearly 8 months old and beginning to show the first signs of the curious, energetic temperament that would clearly define her personality, as she continued growing. That what we built here was never dependent on any single person's continued authority. It was built on principles genuinely capable of sustaining themselves, wherever people were willing to choose them freely and tend them with the same patient care we once learned to offer each other. Chapter 61. The Remnant's renewed activity, when it finally arrived nearly a year after the Eastern settlement's crisis had been successfully resolved, came not as the large-scale, coordinated assault the coalition had spent years preparing to face again, but as something considerably more probing and cautious, a small, isolated reconnaissance effort that Donasig's forces intercepted and repelled within a single evening, well before the incursion could threaten any of the 7 previously contested sites. They are testing our continued readiness, Kale assessed, reviewing the encounter's details with the full council shortly afterward. This was not a genuine attempt to unseal any remaining power. It was reconnaissance, careful and cautious, likely intended to assess whether the coalition's unprecedented cooperation has weakened at all in the years since our decisive victory. And has it weakened? Issei asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on the reconnaissance effort's swift, decisive repulsion. Quite the opposite, Kale confirmed. Our combined forces intercepted and neutralized their probe within hours, well before it could even approach its likely target. If anything, this incident demonstrates that our continued vigilance, and the coalition's ongoing cooperation across 3 factions, has only strengthened in the years since our first confrontation. Surzex, briefed on the incident through the crystal array that had carried so many significant conversations across the years of their deepening alliance, offered a reflection that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying weight considerably beyond simple strategic assessment. I believe this confirms something we have each suspected for some time, he said. The Remnant's patience, however considerable, is not infinite, and their careful reconnaissance suggests genuine uncertainty about whether their original strategy still holds any viable path forward. Whatever they attempt next, I believe it will require considerably more risk on their part than their original, patient plan ever anticipated needing to accept. The incident, while ultimately minor in its immediate consequences, prompted a renewed round of strategic planning across the full coalition, representatives from all 3 factions working alongside the sovereignty's own council to further strengthen the defensive network that had, across the intervening years, grown considerably more sophisticated than the hurried, improvised coordination that had characterized their first, desperate confrontation years earlier. Gabriel, contributing Heaven's own considerable resources to this renewed planning effort, proposed establishing permanent, rotating patrols along the borders of every previously contested site, a suggestion that Kale quickly incorporated into a comprehensive monitoring framework spanning territory belonging to all three factions simultaneously, a level of shared, coordinated vigilance that would have seemed entirely impossible during the cautious, suspicious early years of their separate alliances. It was during this period of renewed strategic focus that Valor returned once more to the fortress, his visits having grown, over the years, from rare and unpredictable to a comfortable, if still irregular, rhythm that reflected the genuine friendship that had gradually developed between him and Issei across their shared history of confronting the remnant's ancient threat together. I hear the reconnaissance effort proved rather anticlimactic, Valley observed, settling into the war chamber with characteristic dry amusement, though Issei recognized, beneath the casual tone, genuine satisfaction at the coalition's continued strength. Donasek's forces handled it before I even received word of the incursion, Issei confirmed. I suspect that swift resolution says considerably more about how far this alliance has grown than any elaborate battle could have demonstrated. Valen nodded slowly, studying the war chamber's familiar mural of dragons in flight with the particular thoughtful attention he had developed over years of increasingly frequent visits. I have spent my entire life pursuing worthy challenges, he said. I find myself, these days, considerably more interested in what you have built here than in any single battle, however worthy. Perhaps that says something about how my own understanding of strength has shifted, watching this sovereignty grow across these years. Chapter 62. Vesper's second birthday, celebrated amid the fortress's now familiar rhythms of careful vigilance and steady, patient growth, brought together the full extended family the sovereignty had become across 8 remarkable years, representatives from every ally and every corner of the wider network gathering to celebrate the small, energetic girl who had grown, in the 2 years since her birth, into a source of considerable joy for the entire community. Issei found himself, during the celebration's quieter moments, reflecting on how completely his understanding of legacy had transformed across the years since first walking alone into these wastes with nothing but grief and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. I used to think legacy meant simply surviving long enough to leave something behind, he told Azazel, as the two of them watched Vesper toddle enthusiastically between the celebration's various guests, her small storm-colored wings fluttering with delighted, uncoordinated energy whenever excitement overtook her. Now I understand it means something considerably different. Not simply what I leave behind, but what continues growing and choosing and building, long after I am no longer the one making every decision. Azazel, watching Vesper's enthusiastic circuit of the celebration with genuine warmth, nodded slowly in agreement. That distinction matters considerably more than most people ever fully understand, he observed. I have watched empires built on the first understanding of legacy, monuments and inherited structures meant to simply endure. I have never before watched anything built on the second understanding, something meant to keep growing and adapting and choosing for itself, long after its founder's direct influence naturally recedes. Do you think that is what we have built here? Issei asked. Something genuinely capable of continuing, adapting, choosing for itself, even beyond whatever years I still have left to guide it directly. I believe the Eastern Settlements crisis, and its resolution, already answered that question decisively, Azazel said. You built something considerably stronger than a single leader's continued presence, Issei. You built genuine, living principles, capable of guiding an entire network of communities toward their own wisdom, their own solutions, their own continued growth. That is not simply legacy. That is something considerably rarer and more valuable, a genuine, self-sustaining culture of belonging that will likely long outlast either of us. As the celebration continued into the evening, Vesper eventually growing tired enough to settle contentedly into Riener's arms, Issei found himself standing once more on the familiar battlements, his wife and daughter beside him, watching the fortress lights burn warm and steady against the settling twilight. Joined now by the distant glow of 4 independent sovereignties scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste. 8 years, he said quietly, watching Vesper's peaceful, sleeping face with profound, quiet wonder. I still find myself surprised, some evenings, by how far this road has traveled since that first desperate night. Do you think, Riener asked softly, watching their daughter's peaceful, sleeping face with the same tender wonder, that Vesper will one day fully understand what it took to build the world she gets to simply inherit and enjoy, the way we understand it, having lived every difficult step of that particular road ourselves. I hope, in a way, that she never fully has to, Issei said thoughtfully. I hope her understanding remains something closer to the story we tell her, warm and complete and slightly removed from the actual grief and uncertainty that built it, rather than lived experience she has to survive herself. That is, perhaps, the truest gift this sovereignty can offer the generation growing up within it. Not simply shelter, but genuine distance from the kind of pain that made shelter necessary for the rest of us in the first place. Ryanair's answering smile, warm and genuine in the fortress's soft evening light, carried 8 years of shared purpose and hard-won love distilled into simple, settled contentment. I think, she said softly, we stopped counting the surprises somewhere around year 5, and simply started trusting that whatever came next, we would build it together, the same way we have built everything else. Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after 8 full years of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who had waited considerably longer than a single dragon lifetime to witness exactly this kind of enduring, self-sustaining legacy finally take root and flourish. Whatever comes next, partner, the dragon said quietly, I believe you have already proven, decisively and repeatedly, exactly what it takes to meet it. Not simply strength, though you have certainly grown considerably stronger across these years. Purpose, patient and unwavering, and the wisdom to build something genuinely capable of outlasting any single crisis or challenge, however considerable. Chapter 63. The 9th year brought with it a quieter kind of challenge than the dramatic crises that had characterized so much of the sovereignty's earlier history, not a single dramatic threat to be met and overcome, but the steady, unglamorous work of maintaining and refining everything 8 years of patient building had already achieved, a season that Elena, during one particularly reflective council session, described as the genuine test of whether their sovereignty could sustain itself through ordinary time as well as extraordinary crisis. We have proven, across 8 remarkable years, that we can meet dramatic challenges, she observed, addressing the assembled council with the same thoughtful clarity that had guided so many of the sovereignty's significant decisions. The chain, Gregory's coup, the remnant, not once but twice now. What we have not yet fully proven is whether the principles we built can sustain genuine, ordinary flourishing across the quieter years between crises, the kind of steady, patient growth that does not announce itself through dramatic confrontation, but simply through the accumulated weight of countless small, daily choices. Issei found himself reflecting on Elena's observation throughout the following months, watching the fortress and its wider network of independent sovereignties continue their steady, unglamorous work, training sessions and council meetings and the countless small negotiations required to keep an expanding network of communities functioning smoothly together, and recognized, gradually, that this quieter season carried its own particular kind of significance, considerably different from the dramatic crises that had once defined so much of the sovereignty's early history, but no less important to everything they continued building together. It was during this quieter season that Kale, whose organizational talents had continued expanding across 9 years of steady growth, proposed an initiative that Issei recognized immediately as carrying considerable significance for the sovereignty's continued evolution. I would like to establish a formal academy, he explained, presenting the proposal to the full council with evident careful preparation. Not simply informal mentorship, the way our community has always shared knowledge and skills among ourselves, but genuine, structured education, drawing on the considerable expertise we have accumulated across 9 years, available not just to our own community's children as they grow, but to residents of every independent sovereignty within our wider network. What would such an academy actually teach? Ryanair asked, genuine interest evident in her question. Vesper, now old enough at nearly 3 years to sit quietly beside her mother during council sessions, observing the proceedings with the same curious, attentive energy that had defined her personality since infancy. Everything that has made our sovereignty successful, Kale said. Governance built on genuine accountability rather than rigid hierarchy. Conflict resolution, drawing on Elena's considerable experience with exactly this kind of institutional mediation. Practical skills, the kind of infrastructure and resource management that allowed our satellite settlements to flourish. And perhaps most importantly, the deeper philosophy underlying everything we have built, the genuine understanding that loyalty freely given creates something considerably stronger than loyalty extracted through fear or obligation. The proposal, refined over subsequent council sessions into a careful, ambitious plan, ultimately won the council's enthusiastic support, and by the year's midpoint, the first cohort of students, drawn from across the entire wider sovereignty network, had begun their studies within a newly constructed wing of the fortress's already considerable library, a genuine center of learning that Issei recognized. Watching its first tentative classes begin, as representing perhaps the most significant investment in the sovereignty's long-term future that the community had yet undertaken. Chapter 64. The Academy's early success, evident within its first several months as students from across the wider network began forming genuine bonds and shared understanding that transcended the particular circumstances of whichever community had originally sheltered them, brought an unexpected benefit that none of the council had fully anticipated during the initiative's original planning. A considerable strengthening of the bonds between the four independent sovereignties themselves, as students returned to their home communities carrying not just practical knowledge, but genuine, personal relationships with peers from across the wider network. We did not simply build a school, Elena observed, during a council session reviewing the Academy's first year of operation. We built a genuine connective tissue between communities that had, until now, remained largely independent of each other, each focused primarily on their own particular growth and challenges. These students are returning home with friendships that span our entire network, and I suspect those friendships will prove considerably more valuable, in the long run, than any single piece of practical knowledge we could have taught them directly. Issei found himself genuinely moved by this unexpected consequence, recognizing in it an echo of the same fundamental principle that had guided the sovereignty's entire remarkable history, that genuine connection, freely chosen and patiently cultivated, tended to create considerably more value than any structure could achieve through careful planning alone. It was during this same period that Asia, whose role within the Watch had continued expanding across the years since her formal joining, approached Issei with a proposal of her own, one that carried, he recognized immediately, considerable personal significance beyond its practical implications. I would like to establish a formal healing division within the Academy, she explained, her confidence carrying the settled certainty of someone who had, across the years since her return to the sovereignty, fully reclaimed the courage that had once eluded her during her earlier years within the Gremory peerage. Not simply training healers in practical technique, though that certainly matters. Training them, specifically, in the kind of proactive care that recognizes danger before it fully arrives, the same lesson I told you, years ago, that I had come here hoping to finally learn. Issei felt genuine pride at Asia's proposal, understanding, with quiet gratitude, exactly how completely her own journey had come full circle across the years since her uncertain return to the fortress gates. I can think of no one better suited to lead such a division, he said. You have spent years proving, through your own transformation, exactly what that kind of proactive courage looks like in practice. I believe our entire network would benefit enormously from learning what you have already discovered. The Healing Division, established under Asia's careful, dedicated leadership, quickly became one of the Academy's most celebrated programs, drawing students from across every corner of the wider sovereignty network eager to learn the particular combination of compassionate care and proactive courage that had come to define Asia's own remarkable transformation. Chapter 65. The 10th year arrived with a quality of settled, hard-won accomplishment that felt, to Issei, considerably different from anything the sovereignty's earlier years had achieved, not the anxious uncertainty of a young community still proving its right to exist, nor even the dramatic triumph of decisive victory against considerable threat, but something quieter and more permanent, the genuine, accumulated weight of a decade spent patiently, honestly building something worth protecting. Standing once more on the familiar battlements as the year's final evening settled over the fortress, Rias beside him with Vesper now old enough at nearly 4 years to stand independently at the wall's edge, her small hand held carefully in her mother's, Issei found himself reflecting on the full, remarkable distance the road had traveled since that first desperate night a full decade earlier. 10 years, he said quietly. watching the fortress lights kindle steady and warm against the deepening violet twilight below, joined now by the considerably more numerous glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste. I do not think I could have imagined any of this, standing on those estate steps a decade ago, watching everyone I trusted walk away in silence. Rionaire's hand found his against the familiar battlement stone, the gesture worn smooth and comfortable by a full decade of quiet repetition, carrying now the accumulated warmth of marriage and motherhood and everything else that had grown from their shared, remarkable partnership across the years since that first desperate night in the deep chamber. I think about that often, she said softly. Not the grief of it, though I know that grief mattered enormously in bringing you to that fortress in the first place. I think about how strange it is that a single night of betrayal, however painful, ultimately led to everything we have built since. A fortress. A family. An entire network of communities, each proving, in their own way, that the old order's certainty about power and loyalty and belonging was wrong from the very beginning. Vesper, tugging gently at her father's hand with the particular insistent curiosity of a young child eager for attention, looked up at him with wide, storm-colored eyes that carried, unmistakably, her mother's fierce, gentle spirit. "Papa, tell me the story again," she said, the request carrying the particular earnestness of a favorite ritual repeated countless times across her young life. "The story of the fortress, and how you found it." Issei felt his chest tighten with profound, quiet love as he knelt down to his daughter's level, the same story he had told her countless times before rising naturally to his lips once more, shaped now by 10 years of patient reflection into something considerably more than simple narrative, a genuine inheritance of everything he hoped she would carry forward into whatever future still waited beyond the horizon. "Once," he began, "there was a boy who lost everything he thought mattered most, and walked alone into a wasteland with nothing left to guide him but a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. He found an ancient fortress, empty and forgotten for 3,000 years, waiting patiently for someone who understood that true strength was never about power alone, but about choosing, again and again, to build something worth protecting alongside people who chose that same building freely, together." Vesper listened with the same rapt attention she always brought to this particular story, her small hand tightening around her father's as the familiar tale unfolded once more beneath the settling twilight. "And then," she prompted, exactly as she always did at this point in the telling, "he found Mama." "And then I found your Mama," Issei confirmed, glancing up at Rionaire with a smile that carried a full decade of shared love and partnership. "Dying alone in a chamber beneath that very fortress, and in saving her life, I discovered something I had not fully understood until that moment. That grief, given enough patience and enough courage and enough people willing to build alongside you, really can become the strongest foundation of all." Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after a full decade of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, something that had grown, slowly and unmistakably, into permanent, unshakable pride. "A decade, partner," the dragon said quietly, warmth evident even through his characteristic ancient gravity. "I have witnessed considerable history across my very long existence, but I do not believe I have ever witnessed anything quite so remarkable as watching a single, stubborn refusal to disappear quietly grow into everything this sovereignty has become. A fortress reclaimed. A family built entirely from choice. An entire network of communities, each proving, in their own way, that a different kind of power was always possible, if only someone was brave enough, and patient enough, to build it honestly." Below them, the fortress lights burned steady and warm against the settling twilight, joined by the distant, considerable glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties, each one proof, patient and unfinished and considerably more remarkable than anyone could have imagined from its beginning, that the old order's certainty about power and worth and belonging had been wrong from the very start. The sovereignty's 10th year had ended. Its story, like the daughter now resting peacefully against her father's shoulder, and the family gathered together beneath the settling twilight, and the entire remarkable network of communities scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste, continued forward, patient and unfinished, one honest, chosen day at a time, for as long as the road ahead still had left to give. Chapter 66. The decade mark brought with it, beyond the quiet, personal celebration Issei shared with his family on the battlements, a considerably larger, formal gathering that the wider sovereignty network organized across several weeks of careful preparation. Representatives from all three allied factions and every independent community within their growing network converging on the central fortress for what Kale had taken to calling, with characteristic organizational precision, the Decade Convocation. The scale of the gathering, when it finally arrived, exceeded even Issei's considerable expectations. The fortress courtyard and surrounding grounds transformed to accommodate delegates and well-wishers numbering well beyond 1,000, a testament to exactly how far the sovereignty's influence had spread across 10 remarkable years of patient, careful building. Surzex, delivering formal remarks on behalf of the Underworld's continued alliance, offered a reflection that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying weight considerably beyond simple diplomatic ceremony. The gathering itself represented, Kale noted with quiet satisfaction as he oversaw the considerable logistics required to accommodate such numbers, perhaps the largest peaceful assembly the Wastes had ever witnessed. Delegates from territories that had once viewed each other with centuries of accumulated suspicion now mingling freely beneath banners representing every faction and every independent sovereignty within their considerable, growing network. 10 years ago, he said, addressing the assembled crowd with genuine, unguarded warmth, my council made a decision I have spent every year since attempting to understand and, where possible, to help repair. We looked at a young man's growing power and saw only danger to be contained. We could not see, in that moment, what growth and purpose and genuine belonging might eventually build from the wreckage of that decision. Issei Hyoudou has spent a decade proving us wrong, not through vengeance or conquest, but through the patient, remarkable work of building something considerably better than anything our old order had managed to construct across centuries of careful, separate governance. Michael, offering his own formal remarks on behalf of Heaven's continued partnership, echoed similar sentiments with the particular gravity that had come to define his own genuine transformation across the years of their deepening alliance. Heaven's doctrine has always claimed redemption as one of our most sacred values, he said. Yet we have too often treated that doctrine as abstract principle rather than lived practice. This sovereignty, and everything it has built across a decade of patient, honest work, stands as living proof that redemption, when genuinely practiced rather than merely preached, can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, entire networks of belonging that ripple outward considerably further than any of us could have originally imagined. Azazel, speaking on behalf of Gregory's own considerable, complicated history with the sovereignty's founding, offered remarks that carried a particular warmth born from his own deep, personal investment in everything the fortress had become across their years of close partnership. I watched a boy walk alone into these wastes a decade ago, he said, addressing the crowd with genuine, unguarded affection. I have watched that boy build a fortress, a family, an alliance spanning 3 factions, a coalition capable of standing against threats older than our current world's entire structure, and now an entire network of independent communities, each proving, in their own way, that the principles we discovered together were never limited to a single place or a single leader's continued presence. I am, and will remain for whatever years I still have left in this very long life, profoundly grateful to have witnessed this remarkable journey unfold. Chapter 67. As the Decade Convocation's formal ceremonies concluded and the gathering settled into a considerably more relaxed, celebratory atmosphere, Issei found himself moving through the crowd, greeting old allies and new faces alike, each conversation carrying its own particular weight of shared history and hard-won friendship built across a decade of patient, careful alliance building. Lord Bale, considerably more frail now than during their first hostile confrontation years earlier but carrying a warmth that would have seemed entirely unimaginable during those early, difficult years, found Issei near the celebration's edge, several of his own children and grandchildren accompanying him with evident genuine affection. I did not expect, when I first walked through these gates prepared for one final confrontation, that I would one day stand here celebrating a decade of your sovereignty's continued success, he admitted, his aged voice carrying genuine warmth beneath its familiar, proud dignity. My own house has changed considerably, in the years since that difficult first conversation. My children have built something within our own structure that draws, I believe, considerable inspiration from everything you demonstrated here. Loyalty freely given, rather than simply inherited through obligation and tradition. I am glad to hear it, Issei said honestly. You once told me you did not know if a house as old and rigid as yours could ever learn what we built here. I am glad to see you found your own way toward that same lesson, in whatever form suited your own particular circumstances. That is precisely the lesson your sovereignty taught me, more than any single principle, Bayo reflected. That genuine wisdom adapts itself to circumstance, rather than demanding rigid uniformity. I do not know if I will live to see my own house's continued transformation reach its full potential. But I am grateful, genuinely, to have witnessed enough of it to understand the path forward exists, where once I believed only decline and irrelevance awaited a structure as old as mine. Rias, present at the celebration as part of the Underworld's formal delegation, found Issei during a quieter moment near the fortress's edge, her own presence carrying, after years of careful, gradual distance transformed into something considerably more peaceful, none of the tension that had once characterized their earlier, more difficult encounters. 10 years, she said softly, watching the celebration's warm lights with genuine, unguarded reflection. I still find myself thinking, sometimes, about that throne room, and everything that followed from the silence we offered you that day. I am not certain that particular wound will ever fully heal, for either of us. But I am genuinely, deeply grateful to see what grew from it, regardless. I am too, Issei said honestly, and found, in that simple exchange, that the words carried genuine peace rather than merely diplomatic courtesy, a full decade of separate, hard-won growth finally settling into something considerably more resolved than the careful, cautious reconciliation they had first attempted years earlier. As evening finally settled over the decade convocation's continued celebration, Issei made his way back toward the familiar battlements, finding Ryanair there with Vesper already asleep against her shoulder, the vast gatherings warm, distant sounds drifting up from the fortress grounds below. Quite a decade, Ryanair observed softly, as Issei settled beside her, watching the celebration's considerable scale with quiet, profound wonder. Quite a decade, he agreed. I keep thinking about how impossible all of this would have seemed, standing on those Gremory estate steps 10 years ago. Not just the fortress, or the Alliance, or even Vesper. This. An entire community, considerably larger than anything I could have imagined, gathered together simply to celebrate everything we built from nothing but grief and refusal. Ryanair's smile, warm and genuine in the settling twilight, carried a decade of shared purpose and hard-won love distilled into simple, profound contentment. I think, she said softly, that is exactly what makes tonight so remarkable. Not that we built something large, though we certainly did. That we built something worth this many people traveling considerable distances simply to celebrate together. That is not measured in territory or political recognition, Issei. That is measured in genuine, freely given love, and I do not believe any single fortress, however grand, could have earned that kind of devotion through power or fear alone. Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly once more in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after a full decade of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who understood, better than almost anyone else present at tonight's remarkable celebration, exactly how far the road had traveled since that first desperate night in the wastes. 10 years, partner, the dragon said quietly. And I suspect, watching everything gathered here tonight, that whatever the next decade still holds in store, you have already proven, decisively and completely, exactly what it takes to meet it. Not simply strength, though you have certainly grown considerably stronger. Purpose, patient and unwavering, and a genuine, unshakable belief that grief, given enough time and enough love, really can become the strongest foundation of all. Chapter 68. In the weeks following the decade convocation's considerable celebration, as the fortress gradually settled back into its familiar, steady rhythms, Issei found himself drawn increasingly toward a particular kind of reflection, prompted in part by Vesper's persistent, curious questions about the fortress's ancient history, and in part by his own growing awareness that the story he had once believed belonged primarily to himself had, across a full decade, grown into something considerably larger and more collectively owned than any single person's personal narrative. It was Kale who first suggested, during a quiet council session focused on the Academy's continued expansion, that the sovereignty's remarkable history deserved more permanent documentation than the scattered records and oral tradition that had, until now, preserved its considerable legacy. "We have built something remarkable," he observed, addressing the council with the same careful, thoughtful precision that had guided so many of the sovereignty's significant initiatives. "But our history exists primarily in memory and scattered records, vulnerable to the same kind of loss that claimed so much of Ritra's own ancient history before we recovered what fragments survived in this fortress's deepest archives. I would like to propose a formal historical record, not simply for our own community's benefit, but for every future generation who walks through these gates, and for every independent sovereignty within our wider network who might benefit from understanding the full, considerable journey that led to everything we have collectively built." Elena, whose own considerable skill with careful documentation had proven invaluable across years of council work, offered immediate support for the proposal. "I would be honored to help lead such an effort," she said. "Not simply recording dates and events, but preserving the genuine wisdom embedded within our history, the hard-won lessons from the chain, from Gregory's coup, from the remnants' ancient threat, from every crisis and celebration that has shaped what we have collectively become." The historical project, launched within weeks of the Council's enthusiastic approval, gradually grew into something considerably more ambitious than its original modest proposal, drawing contributions not just from the Central Fortress's own considerable archive, but from every independent sovereignty within the wider network. Each community offering their own particular chapter of the collective story that had grown, across a decade, into something considerably larger than any single fortress's individual history. Issei found himself, during the project's early months, sitting for extended interviews with Elena and her small team of dedicated historians, recounting details of the sovereignty's founding that he had not fully articulated, even to himself, in the years since those difficult, formative early days. "I keep thinking about how much of this story I have simply carried in memory, without ever fully examining it," he admitted during one such session, Elena's careful questions drawing forth reflections he had not previously fully considered. The throne room. The estate steps. That first night walking alone into these wastes. I lived through all of it, obviously, but I do not think I ever stopped to consider what it might mean to future generations who never experienced any of that grief firsthand, who will simply inherit the fortress and the family and the network we built from it, without ever fully understanding the difficult road that made all of it possible. "That is precisely why this record matters so much," Elena said gently. "Not simply to preserve facts, but to preserve understanding, the genuine, hard-won wisdom that grief, given enough patience and enough courage, really can transform into something considerably stronger than the pain that first created it. Future generations deserve to understand that lesson, not simply inherit its results without ever grasping the difficult journey that made those results possible." Chapter 69. The historical project's steady progress, unfolding across the following months alongside the sovereignty's continued, ordinary work of maintaining and expanding its considerable network, brought with it an unexpected consequence that Issei had not fully anticipated when the initiative first began, a renewed sense of connection among the wider community's older residents, many of whom found themselves, through the careful documentation process, reconnecting with memories and shared experiences that had grown somewhat distant across the accumulated weight of a decade's steady, ordinary living. Donasik, contributing his own considerable first-hand account of the sovereignty's early defensive challenges, found himself, during one particularly extended interview session, reflecting on how completely his own life had transformed since those uncertain early days. "I spent decades as a stray devil before finding these gates," he told Elena's historical team, his weathered voice carrying genuine, reflective warmth. "Decades of simply surviving, moving from place to place, never trusting anyone enough to build something lasting. I did not understand, walking through these gates for the first time, that I was not simply finding temporary shelter. I was finding the first genuine home I had known since before my own difficult exile from whatever life I had once lived as a proper devil." Ryanair, offering her own extensive contribution to the historical record, found herself, during her interview sessions, revisiting memories of that first desperate night in the deep chamber with a clarity that surprised her, even after a decade of the story's countless retellings to Vesper and to visiting dignitaries alike. I remember believing, with absolute certainty, that I would die alone in that chamber, she told Elena's team, her voice carrying the particular weight of memory examined carefully rather than simply recounted from habit. I had spent months running, certain that Gregory's assassins would eventually catch me, and I had finally accepted that certainty as simple, unavoidable fact. What I could not have anticipated, in that moment, was that the very fortress I had chosen to die within would become, instead, the foundation of everything my life has since become. A husband. A daughter. A genuine, extended family spanning an entire network of communities. I do not think grief prepares you for that kind of transformation, no matter how many years you spend building toward it deliberately. As the historical project continued its careful, patient documentation work, Issei found himself increasingly struck by how many of the sovereignty's residents, when finally given the opportunity to fully articulate their own particular journey toward these gates, discovered new depths of understanding about their own transformation that the ordinary, steady rhythm of daily life had not previously allowed them to fully examine. We are not simply documenting our history, he observed to Rias, during one quiet evening as the project's steady progress continued across the fortress's various departments and communities. We are giving people permission to fully understand their own transformation, the genuine distance they have traveled from wherever grief or exile or simple desperation first brought them to these gates. Chapter 70. As the 11th year began settling over the fortress, the historical project reaching its own natural conclusion after nearly a full year of careful, patient documentation work, Issei found himself once more on the familiar battlements, the completed record's considerable weight, gathered into a series of carefully preserved volumes now housed within the Academy's expanding library. Representing something he recognized, with quiet, profound satisfaction, as perhaps the sovereignty's most enduring legacy yet constructed, Vesper, now old enough at nearly 5 years to understand considerably more of the historical record's significance than her earlier years had allowed, had taken to spending considerable time within the library's newly dedicated historical archive, poring over illustrated accounts of the sovereignty's founding with the same rapt, curious attention she had always brought to her father's frequently repeated bedtime story. I read about Rias finding you when you first arrived, she told Issei one evening, settling beside him on the familiar battlements with the easy confidence of a child who had never once known what it meant to feel unwelcome or unwanted within these walls. And about the chain, and about the remnant, and about how you and Surzex became friends even after everything that happened at the beginning. It is a very long story, Papa. It is, Issei agreed, settling down beside his daughter with quiet, profound tenderness. And it is still being written, Vesper. Every single day, this fortress and everyone within it adds another small chapter to that considerable story, the same way you will, when you grow old enough to choose your own particular part in it. Will I get to help build it too? She asked, her wide, storm-colored eyes carrying genuine, earnest curiosity. You already are, Issei said softly. Simply by growing up within these walls, surrounded by everyone who chose to build this family together, you are already part of everything this sovereignty continues to become. Someday, when you are old enough, you will choose your own particular way to keep building it further, the same way everyone within these walls eventually chooses their own path forward. Rias, joining them at the battlement's edge as the evening settled fully into its familiar, comfortable twilight, wrapped her arms gently around both her husband and daughter, the three of them standing together in quiet, contented silence as the fortress lights kindled steady and warm below, joined by the considerable, distant glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste. 11 years, she said softly, echoing the same quiet reflection that had marked so many of their significant evenings together across the past decade and beyond. 11 years, Issei confirmed, watching his daughter's peaceful, contented face with profound, quiet wonder. And I suspect, watching everything we have built together across that considerable span, that however many years still remain ahead of us, we will meet them the same way we have met everything before. Together. One honest, chosen day at a time. Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly once more in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, After 11 full years of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who understood, more completely than perhaps anyone else within the entire fortress, exactly how remarkable the journey from that first desperate night had ultimately become. I have been thinking, partner, the dragon continued, of something you asked me long ago, on those cold estate steps, whether a king could be built from nothing but grief and refusal. I told you then it was time to build your own table. I did not fully understand, in that moment, exactly what such a table might eventually grow to hold. A fortress reclaimed from 3,000 years of patient waiting. A coalition spanning 3 factions, capable of standing against threats older than the world's current structure. An entire network of independent communities, each proving, in their own way, that a different kind of belonging was always possible. A daughter, born into unconditional welcome rather than fear or obligation. I do not believe any dragon king who ever sat upon that ancient seat before you built anything half so remarkable, in all the considerable centuries this fortress has stood. You give me too much credit, Issei said quietly, though the words carried genuine, humbled gratitude rather than simple deflection. None of this belongs to me alone. Every single person who chose to walk through these gates, and stay, built this alongside me. Ryanair, Elena, Donasik, Kale, Asia, Azazel, Surzex, and Michael, and even, in his own complicated way, Lord Bale. This table has never had a single builder, Drake. That has always been the entire point. Perhaps that is precisely why it has endured, and continues enduring, where so many other thrones and empires eventually crumble beneath their own singular weight, Drake said. A table built by many hands rather than one, does not depend on any single hand remaining steady forever. It grows stronger, instead, with every new hand that joins in the patient, ongoing work of building it further. The gates remained open. The family kept growing. And the story, patient and unfinished and considerably more remarkable than anyone could have imagined from its beginning, continued forward, one honest, chosen day at a time, for as long as the road ahead still had left to give. Chapter 71. 5 years passed in the particular way that peaceful, purposeful years tended to pass, each one distinct in its own small triumphs and challenges yet blending, in retrospect, into a single, continuous season of steady growth, and by the time Vesper reached her 10th year, the fortress and its considerable network of independent sovereignties had settled into a rhythm of prosperity that Issei, watching his daughter grow into a thoughtful, increasingly capable young girl, found himself treasuring with a gratitude that had only deepened across the accumulated weight of 15 remarkable years since his exile first began. It was into this hard-won peace that a stranger arrived at the fortress gates on an autumn evening, alone and visibly exhausted, carrying herself with the particular wariness of someone who had spent considerable time expecting pursuit that might arrive at any moment. I need to speak with the sovereign directly, she said, when Donasik's watch brought her before the war chamber, her voice carrying a strained, careful quality that immediately drew Issei's full attention. I was once part of the remnant. I have information you need to hear, and I do not have considerable time before they realize I am gone. The woman, who gave her name simply as Ves, spent the following hours recounting a story that settled increasingly grave weight over the assembled council. Details of the remnant's continued, patient work across the years since their 2 previous defeats, careful reconstruction of strategy that had shifted, considerably, in response to the coalition's decisive interventions. They never intended those 7 sites as their true target, she explained, her account carrying the particular precision of someone who had spent years embedded within an organization's careful planning. Those were preparation, gathering enough scattered power to eventually converge at a single, far more significant location, one that predates even Vitra's fortress, a place the current factional order has entirely forgotten existed. They call it, in their own oldest records, simply the origin, the site where the ancient conflict between heaven and the old gods first truly began, before it fractured into the war that eventually created your current 3 factions. Kale, listening with growing alarm, immediately began cross-referencing Bessa's account against the historical archive's considerable collection of ancient texts. This would explain gaps in our own understanding, he said slowly, working through implications even as the briefing continued. We assumed the 7 sealed sites represented the full scope of the ancient force the remnant sought to reclaim. If an 8th, more significant location exists, one specifically designed to receive convergence from all 7 others, our previous victories may have simply been delaying an inevitability we did not fully understand until this moment. Why are you telling us this now? Issei asked, studying Vess carefully, recognizing in her guarded, exhausted bearing something that felt, unexpectedly, familiar, an echo of his own experience finding Ryanair dying in that deep chamber so many years earlier. Because I joined the remnant believing their cause was righteous, restoring power the old order had unjustly sealed away rather than properly understood, Vess said. I spent years believing that conviction completely. But I have watched, across recent months, as their leadership grew increasingly willing to sacrifice their own members in pursuit of that final convergence, treating genuine lives as simply expendable resources toward an ancient goal none of us fully understand even now. I could not continue serving a cause that had become, in practice, exactly the kind of careless cruelty I once believed we were working to prevent. Chapter 72. Vesper, whose curious, attentive nature had only grown more pronounced across her 10 years of life within the fortress, found herself drawn toward the war chamber's continuing crisis discussions despite her parents' careful attempts to shield her from the full weight of the unfolding danger, her presence in the chamber's periphery becoming, gradually, something Issei found himself unable to fully discourage. I want to understand what is happening, she told him directly, during a quiet moment between council sessions, her storm-colored eyes carrying the same fierce, determined spirit that had defined her personality since infancy. Everyone keeps trying to protect me from the details, but I already know something serious is happening. I would rather understand it clearly than be frightened by half-explanations and worried expressions. Issei studied his daughter for a long moment, recognizing in her request an echo of his own long-ago insistence on facing difficult truths directly rather than accepting comfortable evasion, and found himself, despite every protective instinct urging otherwise, honoring her genuine maturity with honest explanation. There is a threat, considerably older than our current world's factional order, he said carefully, choosing words that balanced honesty against the genuine fear he still felt at exposing his daughter to danger's full weight. It has tested us twice before, and we defeated it both times. But we have just learned their true goal was always something larger than what we previously understood, and we do not yet know exactly how we will need to respond. Will you have to fight again? Vesper asked, her voice carrying careful, controlled worry rather than open fear. I do not know yet, Issei admitted honestly. But if I do, I promise you this. I will not face it alone, the same way I have never faced any significant challenge alone since finding this fortress. Your mother, and Azazel, and Elena, and Kale, and Valley, and an entire coalition spanning 3 factions, we will face whatever comes together, the same way we have faced everything else across these 15 years. Vesper considered this for a long moment, her expression carrying a thoughtfulness that felt, to Issei, considerably beyond her 10 years, before finally speaking again with quiet, determined resolve. I want to help, however I can, she said. I know I am still young, and I know there is likely little I can actually do in a direct confrontation. But I have been studying with the Academy's Healing Division under Asia's guidance, and I have been learning some basic defensive techniques from Mother's Fallen Angel Corps. I do not want to simply wait here, frightened and helpless, while everyone I love faces this danger without me. Issei felt profound, complicated emotion at his daughter's earnest request, pride and fear intertwining in equal measure, as he recognized, with sudden clarity, that Vesper had inherited not simply her mother's storm-colored wings, but the same fierce, determined spirit that had carried both her parents through every significant crisis of their own remarkable journey. We will discuss your role carefully, with your mother and with Asia, he said finally. I cannot promise you a place in direct confrontation, not at 10 years old, regardless of how much courage you have already shown. But I can promise you this will not be a conversation where your voice goes unheard, the same way this entire sovereignty has always valued every voice within these walls, regardless of age or standing. Chapter 73. The Coalition's response to Vessa's revelation, coordinated across the following weeks through the same crystal array network that had carried so many significant conversations across the years of their deepening alliance, brought together representatives from all three factions with an urgency that echoed, unmistakably, the same desperate coordination that had once defined their first confrontation against the Remnant's ancient threat. Surzex, presiding over the full coalition's emergency session alongside Michael and the newly restored Gregory leadership, addressed the assembled representatives with grave, focused clarity. If Vessa's account proves accurate, and Kale's cross-referencing against our own historical archives strongly suggests it does, he said, we are facing something considerably more significant than either of our two previous confrontations. Not simply another attempt to unseal a single portion of ancient power, but the Remnant's true, original goal, one that our previous victories may have only delayed rather than genuinely prevented. Kale, presenting the coalition with his own careful research into the origin's likely location, offered findings that carried sobering implications for the confrontation ahead. The site exists, according to our oldest recovered texts, at the precise geographic center of what would eventually become all three current factional territories, he explained. It has remained hidden, likely through deliberate concealment by whatever ancient alliance first sealed the scattered power across the 7 sites, precisely to prevent exactly the kind of convergence the Remnant now intends to attempt. And you believe the Remnant has finally located it, despite that deliberate concealment? Gabriel asked. Vessa's testimony suggests they have spent years narrowing its likely location through careful research parallel to our own, Kale confirmed. If their calculations prove accurate, and if they have gathered sufficient residual power from their access to the 7 previously sealed sites, even in defeat, they may already possess what they need to attempt a final, decisive convergence. Valley, present for the coalition's emergency planning with the same sharp, engaged focus that had characterized his involvement in their first confrontation years earlier, offered a blunt assessment that cut directly to the heart of the strategic challenge ahead. Then we do not have the luxury of careful, extended preparation this time, he said. We move quickly, decisively, and we commit the full weight of this coalition to preventing that convergence, understanding that failure here would likely prove considerably more catastrophic than either of our previous confrontations combined. Issei, listening to the assembled coalition's grave deliberations with the particular clarity that had carried him through every previous crisis across 15 remarkable years, felt the weight of an impending confrontation that would likely define, decisively, whether everything the sovereignty had built across those years could finally achieve lasting, permanent security against a threat that had patiently waited considerably longer than any of their current alliances had existed. Then we move together, he said, addressing the full coalition with steady, unwavering purpose. Every faction, every ally, every resource this sovereignty and its considerable network has accumulated across 15 years of patient, careful building. We do not simply delay this threat again. We end it, decisively and permanently, so that Vesper's generation, and every generation that follows, never has to face what our own generation has spent these years learning to overcome. Chapter 74. The weeks of preparation that followed brought together the full weight of everything the sovereignty and its allied coalition had built across 15 years of patient, careful growth, resources and forces drawn from every corner of their considerable network, all directed toward a single, unprecedented mobilization aimed at reaching and securing the origin before the Remnant could complete whatever final convergence their patient, ancient scheme had spent centuries building toward. Ryanair, coordinating the Fallen Angel Corps' considerable contribution to the coalition's assembled forces, found herself, during a rare quiet moment amid the frantic preparation, sharing a private conversation with Issei that carried the particular weight of 2 parents confronting the genuine possibility of a confrontation considerably more dangerous than anything their family had previously faced together. I do not want Vesper anywhere near the actual confrontation, she said quietly, her voice carrying the careful, measured control of someone determined not to let fear overwhelm necessary clarity. But I also understand, watching her these past weeks, that simply forbidding her involvement entirely may prove counterproductive, given how thoroughly she has already committed herself to helping in whatever way she can. Issei nodded slowly, understanding completely the difficult balance his wife was attempting to navigate. Asia has proposed a compromise, he said. Vesper could join the Healing Division's rear support team, stationed at a secure staging point considerably removed from the actual confrontation, but close enough to provide meaningful medical support to wounded forces requiring evacuation. It would give her genuine purpose without placing her directly within danger's immediate reach. That feels like the right balance, Ryanair said, though her expression carried the particular difficulty of a mother acknowledging her child's growing independence even amid genuine danger. She is going to keep growing more capable and more determined to help, Issei, regardless of how much we might wish to shield her from this world's genuine dangers indefinitely. Perhaps the wisest thing we can do is guide that growing capability carefully, rather than simply trying to suppress it entirely. Vesper, informed of the compromise during a family conversation that carried genuine gravity despite her young age, received the decision with the same fierce, focused determination that had characterized her request from the very beginning. "I will not let you down," she promised, her storm-colored eyes carrying unmistakable resolve. "I have been training with Asia for months specifically because I wanted to be ready for exactly this kind of moment. I understand this is dangerous, and I understand why you both want to keep me as safe as possible. But I also understand that being part of something worth protecting means being willing to help protect it, even when that help feels frightening." Chapter 75. The Coalition's forces departed for the Origin's suspected location on a gray, overcast morning that felt, to Issei, appropriately weighted with the significance of everything the coming confrontation might ultimately determine. Representatives from all three factions moving alongside the Sovereignty's own considerable forces in a coordinated deployment that dwarfed even their previous confrontation against the Remnant's earlier, more limited ambitions. The journey toward the Origin's hidden location, guided by Kale's careful research and Vess's own first-hand knowledge of the Remnant's likely approach routes, revealed, gradually, evidence of considerable Remnant activity already underway, scattered forces moving with purposeful urgency toward a destination that Kale's calculations suggested lay just beyond the horizon. "They are already beginning preparatory rituals," Kale reported, studying scattered evidence gathered by advanced scouts with growing alarm. "If our estimates prove accurate, we may have arrived with only days, perhaps even hours, before they achieve whatever final convergence their patient, ancient scheme has been building toward across considerable time." The confrontation, when it finally began, unfolded across a landscape unlike anything the Coalition's forces had previously encountered, ancient stone architecture predating even Vitra's fortress rising from ground that seemed to pulse with barely contained, ancient power, the Remnant's forces arrayed in careful, ritual formation around a central structure that Drake, upon first sensing its presence, identified with unmistakable, grave recognition. "That is the true seat of the ancient conflict, partner," the dragon said, his voice carrying weight considerably beyond his usual measured gravity. "The place where the old gods and heaven first drew their battle lines, before that conflict fractured into everything the current world's factional structure eventually became. If the Remnant achieves convergence here, they will not simply unleash a single fragment of ancient power. They will potentially reopen a conflict this world has spent millennia trying to move beyond entirely." The battle that followed tested every resource the Coalition had assembled across weeks of careful, unprecedented preparation, Vala's considerable power combining with Ryanair's precisely coordinated aerial forces, representatives from all three factions lending their own considerable abilities to a confrontation that felt, increasingly, like the decisive culmination of everything the Sovereignty's 15 years of patient building had ultimately been preparing them to face. It was Issei himself, pressing through the Remnant's fiercest resistance toward the central structure where their leadership had gathered to attempt the final convergence, who finally confronted the same ancient entity that had once tested his control years earlier, its presence now considerably stronger, drawing on power gathered from years of patient, careful preparation. "You have delayed us twice," the entity said, its form carrying a solidity and power that felt considerably more dangerous than their previous confrontation had suggested. "This time, your interference arrives too late. The convergence has already begun. You cannot stop what has already started." Chapter 76. The confrontation that followed tested Issei's hard-won control more severely than any previous battle across his entire remarkable journey. The ancient entity's considerably strengthened power straining against every careful boundary 15 years of patient discipline had taught him to maintain, even as the surrounding battle's chaos threatened to overwhelm the coalition's coordinated defense entirely. "Partner, I sense the convergence reaching critical threshold," Drake warned, urgent and grave. "If it completes, the power released will not simply threaten this single confrontation. It will threaten the stability of the current factional order entirely, potentially reopening wounds this world has spent millennia trying to heal." "Then we do not let it complete," Issei said, forcing the words out even as he fought to hold steady against the entity's overwhelming pressure, the boosted gears crimson light straining at boundaries that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain to hold. It was in that critical, uncertain moment, as the battle's fate hung genuinely undecided, that reinforcement arrived from an unexpected direction. Asia's rear support team, stationed at what should have been a secure staging point considerably removed from the confrontation's front lines, moving forward with careful, coordinated purpose to provide exactly the kind of sustained magical support the coalition's exhausted forces desperately needed to hold their ground. And among that support team, moving with a determination that made Issei's heart simultaneously swell with pride and clench with fear, Vesper herself, her small hands glowing with the careful healing magic she had spent months learning under Asia's patient guidance, working alongside her mentor to sustain wounded coalition fighters who would otherwise have been forced to withdraw from the confrontation entirely. "Vesper," Issei called out, torn between fierce parental worry and the desperate strategic need for exactly the support she was providing. "I promised I would help, Papa," she called back, her voice carrying steady, focused determination despite the battle's considerable chaos surrounding them. "This is how I can help, from here, keeping our people fighting when they would otherwise have to fall back." The additional support, arriving at precisely the moment the coalition's forces most desperately needed it, provided exactly the sustained strength required to finally, decisively turn the battle's momentum, and Issei, drawing on that renewed collective strength, felt his own control steady once more, the desperate uncertainty of moments earlier giving way to the same focused, purposeful strength that 15 years of patient discipline had carefully cultivated. "I am not fighting for myself," he said, addressing the ancient entity with renewed, unwavering clarity. "I am fighting for a daughter learning, even at 10 years old, exactly what it means to help protect something worth protecting. I am fighting for an entire coalition that chose, freely and completely, to stand together against exactly this kind of ancient, patient threat. Whatever power you have gathered across these considerable years, you are not facing a single dragon anymore. You are facing everything 15 years of genuine, chosen unity can build." The boosted gears' crimson light surged with renewed, focused intensity, and Issei, drawing on the full weight of everything the coalition's coordinated strength provided, finally forced the ancient entity back from the convergence point. The careful, patient ritual the remnant had spent considerable years constructing collapsing entirely beneath the combined might of an alliance their ancient patience had never fully anticipated needing to face at this particular scale. "This is not ended," the entity said, its form beginning to fracture and dissolve beneath the coalition's overwhelming combined strength, voice carrying, even in this considerably more decisive defeat, a stubborn, patient defiance that suggested the remnant's ancient cause would not easily accept final, permanent resolution. "Perhaps not today," Issei said, watching the entity's form finally dissolve entirely beneath the combined weight of everything 15 years of patient alliance building had ultimately made possible. "But know this. Every year you continue waiting, this coalition grows stronger, and now, watching my own daughter stand alongside us today, I understand something I did not fully grasp during our previous confrontations. This fight was never simply about defending what my generation built. It is about ensuring her generation, and every generation that follows, inherits a world considerably safer than the one my own grief once walked alone into." Chapter 77. The aftermath of the Origin's decisive confrontation brought a period of careful, extensive assessment across the entire coalition, representatives from all three factions working alongside Kale's research team to fully understand exactly what the battle had achieved, and what, if anything, still remained of the remnant's ancient, patient threat. The convergence site itself, thoroughly examined by scholars from every corner of the coalition's considerable network in the weeks following the confrontation, revealed evidence that Kale, presenting his findings to the assembled council, described with cautious, measured optimism. The ritual structure the remnants spent considerable years constructing has been thoroughly destabilized, he reported. Based on our careful analysis, achieving anything resembling their original convergence attempt would now require rebuilding from nearly the very beginning, a process that would likely require decades, if not centuries, of the same patient preparation that brought them to this point in the first place. And the entity itself, Elena asked, studying the report with careful attention. What became of the power it represented? Scattered, as best we can determine, Cale said. Not destroyed entirely. I do not believe such power can ever be fully eliminated, only contained or dispersed. But scattered considerably more thoroughly than our previous victories achieved, likely requiring the remnant to begin their entire patient strategy again from nearly its original starting point. Surzex, listening to the full assessment with the same grave attention he had carried throughout the entire crisis, offered a reflection that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying weight considerably beyond simple strategic relief. This does not guarantee permanent safety, he cautioned. The remnant's patience has already proven capable of spanning millennia. A setback measured in decades or centuries may prove, to an organization with their particular perspective on time, simply another temporary delay rather than genuine defeat. But I believe we have achieved something considerably more valuable than simple tactical victory today. We have proven, decisively and completely, that whatever ancient patience the remnant still possesses, our own coalition's continued strength and unity can meet it, generation after generation if necessary, for as long as that patience continues testing us. Issei, listening to the assembled council's careful assessment, found himself reflecting on Vessa's own continued presence within the fortress, the former remnant operative having remained, in the weeks following the confrontation, gradually integrating into the sovereignty's community with the same careful, patient process every previous exile had once undergone. What will happen to her, he asked, referring to Vess directly, understanding the particular significance her continued safety carried for the coalition's broader relationship with any future remnant defectors who might, in years to come, similarly choose to abandon their ancient organization's increasingly costly cause. She has asked to remain here, permanently, Elena reported. She has been remarkably forthcoming with additional intelligence throughout our post-battle assessment, and I believe her genuine transformation, much like every other exile who has found their way to these gates across 15 years, deserves the same unconditional welcome this sovereignty has always extended. Then let her stay, Issei said simply. Whatever she once was, she chose, at considerable personal risk, to help prevent a catastrophe that would have harmed considerably more than simply our own coalition. That choice matters more than whatever organization she once belonged to. Chapter 78. Vesper's role in the Origin's decisive confrontation, while carefully kept from any direct combat exposure, nonetheless earned her a particular kind of recognition within the fortress's community that Issei found himself navigating with careful, deliberate attention, understanding the genuine importance of honoring his daughter's contribution without allowing that recognition to distort her own continued, healthy development. The Council formally acknowledged her contribution during a session held shortly after the Coalition's return, Asia personally presenting a detailed account of the sustained healing support Vesper had provided throughout the battle's most critical, uncertain hours. Her support arrived at precisely the moment our forces most desperately needed it, Asia reported, addressing the assembled council with evident, genuine pride. I want to be clear that Vesper's contribution was not simply a young girl standing bravely amid danger. It was skilled, effective healing work, performed under considerable pressure, that directly enabled several of our coalition's forces to remain in the fight during the battle's most decisive moments. Vesper, present for the formal recognition despite her evident discomfort with the attention it drew toward her, offered a response that carried the same thoughtful maturity that had characterized her request to help in the first place. I do not want special recognition for simply doing what I had trained to do, she said, addressing the council with careful, earnest sincerity. Everyone who fought that day deserves recognition, considerably more than I do. I was scared, and I was far from the actual fighting, and I only did what Asia had already spent months teaching me to do. I would rather this recognition go toward thanking everyone who faced far greater danger than I did. Elena, watching the exchange with evident approval, offered a reflection that Issei recognized, immediately, as capturing something essential about his daughter's particular character. That humility, she observed quietly to Issei afterward, speaks considerably more to her genuine character than any battlefield contribution could demonstrate alone. She has inherited something remarkable from both her parents, Issei. Not simply courage, though she certainly has that in abundance. Genuine humility about that courage, understanding that meaningful contribution never requires seeking recognition for its own sake. In the months that followed, Vesper's continued involvement with the Academy's healing division deepened considerably, Asia gradually expanding her responsibilities in ways that honored both her demonstrated capability and her parents' continued, careful insistence on age-appropriate boundaries, and Issei found himself, watching his daughter's steady growth, reflecting increasingly on how completely her own particular journey was already beginning to diverge from his own difficult path toward the sovereignty's founding. She will never know what it means to walk alone into an unclaimed wasteland with nothing left to lose, he told Ryanair one evening, as they watched Vesper practicing careful healing technique alongside several other Academy students within the fortress's training grounds. She will simply know what it means to grow up already surrounded by everything that grief eventually built. I find myself, watching her, genuinely grateful that her own story will carry considerably less pain than ours did, even as I hope she carries forward the same fundamental values that made our own difficult journey worthwhile. Chapter 79. The 15th year drew toward its close with a quality of hard-won, settled peace that felt, to Issei, considerably more permanent than anything the sovereignty's previous years of steady growth had achieved, the Origin's decisive confrontation having provided, at long last, genuine confidence that whatever patient threat the scattered remnants might still eventually pose, the Coalition's continued strength and unity stood more than capable of meeting it, whenever and however it eventually arrived. Standing once more on the familiar battlements as the year's final evening settled over the fortress, Ryanair beside him with Vesper now old enough at 10 years to stand independently at the wall's edge without needing her mother's steadying hand, Issei found himself reflecting on the full, remarkable distance the road had traveled since that first desperate night a full 15 years earlier. 15 years, he said quietly, watching the fortress lights kindle steady and warm against the deepening violet twilight below, joined now by the considerably more numerous glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste. I still find myself surprised, some evenings, by how far this road has traveled since that first desperate night. Ryanair's hand found his against the familiar battlement stone, the gesture worn smooth and comfortable by 15 years of quiet repetition, carrying now the accumulated warmth of marriage and motherhood and everything else that had grown from their shared, remarkable partnership across the years since that first desperate night in the deep chamber. I think, she said softly, that we have finally reached something considerably more permanent than simple survival, or even simple prosperity. We have reached genuine, lasting security, the kind that allows a family to simply live, rather than constantly bracing for whatever crisis might arrive next. Vesper, listening to her parents' quiet reflection with the same thoughtful attention she brought to every significant conversation, offered her own observation with the particular clarity that had come to define her growing maturity. I used to think the story Papa told me, about the fortress and finding Mama and everything that followed, was simply history, she said. Something that happened before I existed, that I could only learn about through books and stories. Now I understand it is not finished at all. I am part of it too, the same way everyone else within these walls is part of it. And someday, I suppose, I will have my own chapter to add, the same way everyone here eventually finds their own way to keep building what you started. Issei felt profound, quiet wonder settle through him at his daughter's reflection, understanding, with sudden clarity, that Vesper had grasped something essential about the sovereignty's true nature that even he had not fully articulated until this precise moment. That is exactly right, he said softly. This was never simply my story, or even simply your mother's and mine together. It has always been everyone's story, continuously being written by every single person who chooses to walk through these gates and build something worth protecting alongside everyone else who made that same choice before them. Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly once more in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after 15 full years of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who had witnessed, across considerable centuries of existence, remarkably few stories quite so genuinely remarkable as the one continuing to unfold beneath him on these ancient, familiar battlements. 15 years, partner, the dragon said quietly. And I believe, watching your daughter's own growing wisdom tonight, that whatever years still remain ahead for this sovereignty, they rest in remarkably capable hands, not simply your own, but an entire generation now beginning to understand, and carry forward, everything you first discovered on those cold estate steps so many years ago. Below them, the fortress lights burned steady and warm against the settling twilight, joined by the considerable, distant glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties, each one proof, patient and unfinished and considerably more remarkable than any one could have imagined from its beginning, that grief, given enough time and enough love and enough people willing to build alongside you, really could become the strongest foundation of all. The sovereignty's 15th year had ended. Its story, carried forward now by a new generation already beginning to understand its own part within it, continued onward, patient and unfinished, one honest, chosen day at a time, for as long as the road ahead still had left to give. Chapter 80. In the months following the Origin's decisive confrontation, the wider coalition found itself confronting a question that Sirzek's first raised during a formal session convened specifically to consider the alliance's long-term future, now that the immediate, urgent crisis that had originally necessitated such unprecedented cooperation had finally reached some measure of lasting resolution. We built this coalition to meet a specific, considerable threat, he observed, addressing representatives from all three factions alongside the sovereignty's own council. That threat, while not permanently eliminated, has been considerably diminished, likely for decades or longer. I believe we owe ourselves an honest conversation about what this coalition should become now, whether it simply dissolves back into our previous, separate structures once the immediate danger has fully passed, or whether we have discovered something worth preserving permanently, regardless of whether the remnant ever tests us again. Michael, offering heaven's own perspective on the question, spoke with the same thoughtful gravity that had characterized his continued involvement across the years of their deepening partnership. I do not believe we can simply return to our previous, separate structures, he said. Not because the practical benefits of continued cooperation are not considerable, though they certainly are. Because I believe, having witnessed what genuine, unified cooperation between our three factions can accomplish, returning to our old, careful separation would represent a genuine loss, a retreat from something considerably better than what came before. Azazel, representing Grigory's own considerable investment in the coalition's continued success, offered a perspective shaped by his own decades of experience navigating the old order's careful, separate governance. I have spent centuries watching our three factions maintain careful distance from each other, he said, even during periods of relative peace, treating cooperation as a temporary necessity rather than a genuine, ongoing value. This coalition has proven that assumption wrong, decisively and repeatedly. I do not believe we should simply let that proof fade back into old habit, once the immediate crisis that first necessitated it has passed. The council session that followed, stretching across several days of careful, deliberate discussion, ultimately produced a formal proposal that Issei recognized, immediately, as representing perhaps the most significant structural achievement the sovereignty's 15 years of patient alliance building had yet accomplished, a permanent, standing coalition, formally institutionalized across all three factions and the sovereignty's own considerable network, dedicated not simply to meeting extraordinary crisis, but to the ongoing, routine work of coordinated governance across boundaries that had once seemed permanently, unavoidably separate. We are not asking any faction to surrender their own particular sovereignty or identity, Elena explained, presenting the proposal's careful details to representatives gathered from across the entire coalition. We are simply formalizing what we have already discovered together, that genuine cooperation, freely chosen and consistently practiced, produces considerably more security and considerably more flourishing than careful separation ever achieved on its own. Chapter 81. The formal establishment of what the coalition ultimately named, with characteristic straightforward clarity, simply the Concord, marked a milestone that Issei found himself reflecting on with particular, profound significance during the ceremony that formally inaugurated its permanent structure. A gathering that drew together representatives from all three factions and every independent sovereignty within their considerable network in a celebration that rivaled even the decade convocations. Earlier, considerable scale. 15 years ago, Issei said, addressing the assembled crowd during his own formal remarks marking the Concord's establishment, I walked alone into these wastes carrying nothing but grief and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. I did not imagine, in that desperate moment, that grief might eventually grow into something as remarkable as what we celebrate here today. Not simply a fortress, or even a sovereignty recognized by three factions. A genuine, permanent partnership between powers that once viewed each other with centuries of accumulated suspicion, now formally committed to the ongoing, shared work of building something better together than any of us could build alone. Surzex, offering his own formal remarks immediately following Issei's address, spoke with the particular warmth that had come to define his own genuine transformation across 15 years of deepening friendship and alliance. I once presided over a council that saw only danger in what Issei represented, he said, addressing the crowd with unguarded, genuine reflection. I am profoundly grateful to have lived long enough to instead preside, today, over the formal establishment of a partnership that would have seemed entirely impossible to that same council 15 years ago. This concord exists because one boy refused to let betrayal define the entirety of his story, and instead chose to build something considerably better from its wreckage. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration settled into its considerably more relaxed, joyful atmosphere, Issei found himself, during a quiet moment near the celebration's edge, approached by Ves, the former remnant operative whose defection had ultimately proven so pivotal to the coalition's decisive victory at the origin. I did not expect, when I first arrived at these gates seeking to warn you of danger, that I would eventually witness something quite like this, she admitted, watching the considerable celebration with evident, quiet wonder. I spent years believing the old order's careful separation was simply an unavoidable fact of how power functioned in this world. Watching what you have built here, and now this Concord's formal establishment, I understand that separation was never truly unavoidable. It was simply a choice, repeated so consistently across centuries that it began to feel like unchangeable fact rather than genuine, alterable decision. That is precisely the lesson this entire sovereignty has spent 15 years trying to demonstrate, Issei said. Power and loyalty and cooperation were never fixed, unchangeable facts. They were always choices, freely made and freely renewed, capable of building something considerably better than whatever old habit or old fear might otherwise suggest was the only possible path forward. Ves considered this for a long moment, her expression carrying the particular weight of someone still processing a genuine, fundamental shift in her own understanding of the world. I am grateful, she finally said, to have found my way here, even after everything I once believed and everything I once served. This feels, increasingly, like the genuine home I did not fully understand I was searching for, across all those years serving a cause that ultimately proved willing to sacrifice its own people for an ancient goal none of us ever truly understood. You are welcome here, exactly as you are, Issei said simply, extending the same gesture he had offered every significant ally across 15 remarkable years. Whatever you once were, you chose, at considerable personal risk, to help prevent a catastrophe that would have harmed considerably more than simply this coalition alone. That choice will always matter more than whatever organization once claimed your loyalty before you found the courage to walk away from it. In the weeks that followed, Ves found her own particular place within the fortress's considerable community, initially contributing her detailed knowledge of the remnant's broader organizational structure to Kale's continued research efforts, and gradually, as her own confidence grew alongside the community's steady, unconditional welcome, expanding into roles considerably beyond simple intelligence gathering. She began, several months into her new life within the sovereignty, assisting Donasek's forces with defensive strategy, drawing on years of first-hand experience with the very tactics the remnant had once employed against the fortress itself, and it was Donasek himself who first observed, during one particularly productive strategy session, that Ves's transformation carried echoes of his own long-ago journey from isolated survival toward genuine, chosen belonging. I spent decades as a stray devil before finding these gates myself, he told her one evening, as they reviewed defensive positioning maps together within the war chamber's familiar walls. I understand, better than most, exactly how strange it feels, trusting a community after years spent trusting no one beyond your own careful survival instincts. It does become easier, the longer you allow yourself to actually believe the welcome is genuine rather than simply another temporary shelter waiting to eventually disappoint you. It is becoming easier, Vess admitted quietly. Though I suspect some part of me will always carry a certain wariness, born from everything the remnant taught me to expect from the wider world before I finally found the courage to walk away from it. That wariness does not need to disappear entirely, Donasek said gently. It simply needs to eventually coexist alongside genuine trust, rather than overriding it completely. I have found, across my own years within these walls, that both can hold space together, the careful instinct that once kept you alive, and the growing confidence that this particular home has genuinely earned your trust. Chapter 82. The Concord's early months of formal operation brought with them a steady stream of practical challenges that tested the young institution's genuine capacity for sustained, routine governance considerably more thoroughly than the dramatic crisis that had first necessitated its creation, disputes over resource allocation between member territories. Careful negotiation of jurisdiction in regions where all three factions maintained overlapping historical claims, and the countless small, unglamorous decisions required to translate a formal partnership's noble founding principles into genuine, functional daily practice. Elena, whose considerable experience with institutional governance had made her the natural choice to help guide the Concord's early administrative structure, found herself, during this period, drawing increasingly on lessons first learned resolving the Eastern settlement's internal crisis years earlier. The principles are the same, whether we are mediating a single community's internal dispute or coordinating governance across three entire factions, she observed to Issei during one particularly demanding week of careful negotiation. Genuine accountability. Freely chosen cooperation rather than coerced compliance. The patience to let solutions emerge from honest dialogue rather than imposing them through simple authority. We are simply applying those same fundamental lessons at a considerably larger scale than we originally imagined possible. It was during this demanding early period that Kale, whose organizational talents had continued proving invaluable across every phase of the sovereignty's remarkable growth, proposed an innovation that Issei recognized, immediately, as representing a natural evolution of the historical documentation project completed several years earlier. I would like to establish a formal training program specifically for Concord administrators, he explained, presenting the proposal to the full council with characteristic careful preparation. Drawing on our academy's existing curriculum, but specifically adapted to prepare representatives from across all three factions and our entire sovereignty network for the particular challenges of sustained, cross-factional governance. We have proven, across 15 years, that these principles can guide a single community's flourishing. I believe we can now prove they can guide considerably larger-scale cooperation as well, if we invest properly in preparing the people who will carry that work forward. The proposal, refined over subsequent weeks into a comprehensive training curriculum, ultimately drew its first cohort of students from every corner of the Concord's considerable, expanding network, representatives from all three factions studying alongside delegates from the sovereignty's own independent communities in a program that Issei found himself observing, during its early sessions, with particular, profound satisfaction. We are not simply training administrators, he reflected to Rias, watching the diverse cohort work through a complex mediation exercise during one of the program's early sessions. We are training an entire generation to understand, deeply and practically, exactly what genuine cooperation across old divisions actually requires. That understanding will likely prove considerably more valuable, in the long term, than any single crisis we have overcome across these 15 years. Chapter 83. Vesper's continued growth across the following year brought with it a gradual, natural expansion of her own role within the fortress's considerable community. Her demonstrated capability during the Origins confrontation, combined with her continued dedication to Asia's healing division, earning her increasing responsibility that Issei and Rias navigated with the same careful, deliberate balance they had maintained since her earliest, tentative steps toward genuine contribution. It was during this period that Vesper, now approaching her 11th year, approached her parents with a request that carried, Issei recognized immediately, considerable personal significance beyond its practical implications. "I would like to begin studying the historical record properly," she said, during a quiet family evening on the familiar battlements that had witnessed so many significant conversations across the sovereignty's remarkable history. "Not simply the version you tell me at bedtime, Papa, though I will always treasure that story exactly as you tell it. I want to understand the full account, everything Elena and her team documented, including the difficult parts you have always been careful to soften for me." Issei felt a complicated mixture of pride and protective hesitation at his daughter's request, understanding, even as he recognized her genuine maturity, the particular weight of exposing her fully to the darker chapters of the sovereignty's founding history, the raw grief of his own exile, the genuine danger of confrontations against the chain and the remnant alike. Details he had always carefully filtered during their countless retellings of the fortress's origins. "Are you certain you are ready for the full account?" he asked gently. "Some of it is genuinely difficult, Vesper. Not simply exciting adventure, but real pain, real danger, real loss that several people within this very fortress experienced directly." "I understand that," she said, her storm-colored eyes carrying the same fierce, determined clarity that had defined her request to help during the Origins confrontation years earlier, in a sense. "I am not asking because I want exciting stories. I am asking because I want to genuinely understand everything this sovereignty required to become what it is today, the real cost alongside the real triumph. I think I am ready for that fuller understanding, and I think avoiding it any longer would mean avoiding genuine truth about the family and community I am part of." Ryanair, listening to her daughter's earnest request with evident, quiet pride, offered her own perspective with the same thoughtful care that had guided so many of her own significant decisions across the years. "I think she is right, Issei," she said gently. "We cannot protect her from difficult truth forever, and I believe, watching her handle the genuine danger of the Origins confrontation with such remarkable maturity, that she has already proven herself capable of engaging honestly with difficult reality rather than simply comfortable narrative." Issei considered his wife's words carefully, recognizing in them the same wisdom that had guided so many of the sovereignty's most significant decisions across 15 remarkable years, and finally nodded slowly, accepting his daughter's request with the same careful, deliberate trust he had learned to extend across every significant challenge their family had navigated together. "Then Elena will guide you through the full historical record," he said. "Not all at once, and not without careful conversation about anything that proves particularly difficult to process. But yes, Vesper, I believe you are ready for the complete truth of everything that built this family and this sovereignty, including every difficult chapter alongside every triumphant one." Vesper's smile, warm and genuine in the fortress's soft evening light, carried the particular satisfaction of a young girl taking another deliberate, meaningful step toward fully understanding, and eventually fully inheriting, the remarkable legacy her parents had spent 15 years patiently building. "Thank you, Papa," she said softly. "I promise I will carry it carefully, whatever difficult truths I learn. The same way you have always carried it, across everything you built from that first difficult night." Chapter 84. Vesper's careful study of the sovereignty's full historical record, undertaken over the following months under Elena's patient, thoughtful guidance, brought a gradual transformation to the young girl's understanding of her own family and community that Issei found himself observing with quiet, complicated wonder. Watching his daughter grapple honestly with difficult chapters he had once believed necessary to soften for her sake. "I read about the throne room today," Vesper told him one evening, several weeks into her studies, her expression carrying a thoughtfulness that felt, unmistakably, considerably older than her 11 years. "About standing there, asking if anyone would speak for you, and no one did. I always knew that part of the story, Papa, in the softened version you told me. But reading Elena's full account, with all the details you usually leave out, I think I finally understand how much that silence must have actually hurt." Issei felt his chest tighten with complicated emotion, recognizing in his daughter's words genuine, mature empathy rather than simple childish curiosity. "It hurt considerably more than I ever fully explained to you," he admitted honestly. I do not think I have adequate words, even now, 15 years later, to fully capture exactly what that silence felt like in the moment. Vesper considered this for a long moment, her storm-colored eyes carrying genuine, searching compassion. Is that why this fortress matters so much to you? She asked. Because you never want anyone else to experience that same silence, the way you did. Exactly that, Issei confirmed softly. Every single person who has walked through these gates across 15 years carries their own version of that same silence, their own moment of standing somewhere, wondering if anyone would speak up for them, and receiving only quiet indifference in return. This fortress exists because I refuse to let that particular pain define the entirety of what came after. I chose, instead, to become the voice I once needed and never received. Vesper reached out, taking her father's hand with the same quiet, unguarded tenderness that had always defined their relationship, and Issei felt, in that simple gesture, the particular weight of watching his daughter's own understanding deepen into something considerably more profound than simple historical knowledge, genuine, inherited wisdom about exactly what the sovereignty's founding principles had always been meant to protect. I am glad you built this place, Papa, she said softly. Not just for everyone else who found their way here. For you too. I hope you know that, even now, all these years later. I do know that, Issei said, his voice carrying quiet, unguarded emotion. Though I do not think I fully understood it myself, in those earliest years. I built this fortress believing I was simply protecting others from the same silence I once experienced. It took considerable time before I recognized that building it had also, gradually and completely, healed something within myself that I did not fully realize still needed healing. What was that? Vesper asked gently, her question carrying the same careful, earnest curiosity that had defined so much of her recent growth. The belief that my worth depended entirely on what I could offer someone else, Issei admitted. Rias valued me, in the end, only for what my power could provide her house. I spent considerable time afterward believing that transaction was simply how worth functioned in this world, that I needed to prove myself useful enough to earn belonging. Building this fortress, watching people choose to stay not because I demanded their loyalty but because they genuinely wanted to be here, taught me something I do not think I could have learned any other way. That genuine belonging was never something I needed to earn through usefulness. It was something I deserved simply by existing, the same as everyone else who has ever walked through these gates. Vesper considered her father's words for a long, thoughtful moment, and Issei watched, with quiet wonder, as something in his daughter's expression settled into deeper, more complete understanding. I think that is the most important lesson in the entire historical record, she said finally. Not the battles, or the alliances, or even the concord. Just that. Everyone deserves to belong somewhere, simply because they exist, not because of what they can offer in return. Chapter 85. The 16th year arrived with the particular quality of settled, hard-won peace that had come to characterize the sovereignty's continued flourishing in the years since the Origin's decisive confrontation, the Concord's formal structure now firmly established across the coalition's considerable network, the Academy's training programs steadily preparing an entire generation for the ongoing work of sustained cross-factional governance, and Vesper's own continued growth bringing genuine, quiet joy to a family that had, across 16 remarkable years, built something considerably beyond anything Issei could have imagined during those first desperate days of exile. Standing once more on the familiar battlements as another year drew toward its close, Ryanair beside him and Vesper now old enough at 11 years to contribute her own thoughtful reflections to their quiet, familiar evening ritual. Issei found himself reflecting on how completely his understanding of the sovereignty's true purpose had continued evolving across the accumulated weight of 16 years since his exile first began. I used to measure this sovereignty's success by crisis survived, he observed quietly, watching the fortress lights kindle steady and warm against the deepening violet twilight below. The chain. Bale's blockade. Gregory's coup. The remnant, not once but 3 times now. I understand, watching everything we have built in the quieter years between those crises, that survival was never truly the measure that mattered most. What measure matters more? Ryanair asked, though her tone carried the particular warmth of someone who already suspected her husband's answer. Whether the people within these walls genuinely flourish, Issei said. Whether Vesper grows up understanding, deeply and completely, exactly what unconditional belonging feels like. Whether Ves finds genuine peace after years of service to a cause that ultimately proved willing to sacrifice her. Whether an entire network of independent sovereignties continues discovering their own particular path toward the same fundamental principles we first discovered together in that deep chamber 16 years ago. Crisis tests what we have built. It has never been the true measure of what we have built. Vesper, listening to her parents' quiet reflection with the same thoughtful attention that had defined so much of her recent growth, offered her own observation with the particular clarity that continued to define her expanding understanding of the world she had inherited. I think that is what Elena's historical record actually teaches, more than anything else, she said. Not simply what happened, crisis after crisis, victory after victory. But why it mattered, why every single person who chose to walk through these gates found something here worth staying for, worth building, worth eventually passing forward to whoever comes next. Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly once more in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after 16 full years of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who understood, perhaps more completely than anyone else present on these familiar battlements, exactly how remarkable the accumulated weight of that patient chosen legacy had genuinely become. 16 years, partner, the dragon said quietly. And I believe, watching your daughter's own growing wisdom continue to deepen, that whatever years still remain ahead for this sovereignty, its true legacy was never simply the fortress, or the alliance, or even the Concord's considerable achievement. It was always this. A family, and a community, and an entire generation now beginning to understand, and carry forward, the simple, profound truth that grief, given enough patience and enough love and enough people willing to build alongside you, really can become the strongest foundation of all. Below them, the fortress lights burned steady and warm against the settling twilight, joined by the considerable, distant glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties, each one proof, patient and unfinished and considerably more remarkable than anyone could have imagined from its beginning, that the old order's certainty about power and worth and belonging had been wrong from the very start. The sovereignty's 16th year had ended. Its story, carried forward now by a daughter who understood both its triumph and its cost, and by an entire generation beginning to inherit everything 16 years of patient, honest building had made possible, continued onward, unfinished and remarkable, one honest, chosen day at a time, for as long as the road ahead still had left to give. Chapter 86. The first sign that something unusual had begun stirring within Vesper arrived not as dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, curious observation Asia brought to Issei and Ryanair during a routine healing session shortly after Vesper's 13th birthday, the young girl's magical signature having shifted, subtly but unmistakably, into something Asia's considerable expertise could not immediately categorize. I do not want to alarm either of you unnecessarily, Asia said carefully, addressing Issei and Ryanair together in a private consultation within the Academy's healing wing. But I have noticed, across several recent sessions, that Vesper's magical signature carries qualities I have not previously observed in her, something that does not map cleanly onto either devil or fallen angel heritage individually, nor even the combination the two of you might have expected her to inherit. Ryanair, her protective instincts immediately alert despite Asia's careful, measured tone, leaned forward with evident concern. What kind of qualities, she asked? Something considerably older, Asia said slowly, choosing her words with visible care. Almost draconic in its underlying structure, though not identical to what I have observed in Issei's own boosted gear signature across years of working alongside this family. I believe, though I want to consult further with Kale's research team before stating this with complete confidence, that Vesper may be manifesting some inherited quality from Drake's own ancient bond with her father, something beyond simple genetic inheritance from either parent individually. Issei felt a complicated mixture of concern and quiet, dawning recognition settle through him at Asia's careful assessment, understanding, even before Drake's own voice confirmed the suspicion, exactly what such an inheritance might ultimately mean for his daughter's continued growth. Drake, he said quietly, reaching inward toward the ancient presence that had accompanied him across 16 remarkable years. Do you sense what Asia is describing? The dragon's response, when it finally arrived, carried a weight and complexity Issei had rarely heard from him across their entire long partnership. I have sensed it building for some time, partner, Drake admitted. I did not speak of it sooner because I was not certain myself exactly what it represented. Vesper carries something within her that I have only encountered once before in all my considerable centuries of existence, a resonance that suggests genuine connection to draconic power, not simply inherited from your own bond with me, but something closer to a nascent bond of her own kind, forming naturally from years of proximity to both my presence within you and the fortress's own ancient draconic history. Chapter 87. The revelation prompted immediate, careful investigation. Kale's research team working alongside Asia and Drake's own considerable ancient knowledge to understand exactly what Vesper's emerging abilities might genuinely represent, and the answers that gradually emerged, over several weeks of careful study, brought a mixture of wonder and genuine responsibility that Issei found himself navigating with the same careful deliberation he had once brought to every significant crisis across his own remarkable journey. She is not manifesting a sacred gear, in the conventional sense, Kale explained, presenting the research team's careful findings to the full family during a private council session convened specifically to address the situation. What we believe is happening, based on Drake's own guidance and our research into the fortress's ancient draconic history, is something considerably rarer, a natural resonance bond forming between Vesper and the residual draconic power that has saturated this fortress across 3,000 years of Vitra's original occupation, further strengthened by her own proximity to Drake's bond with her father across her entire life. What does that mean, practically, for her continued growth? Rias asked, her protective concern evident even as she listened with careful, attentive focus to the research team's findings. It means, Drake said, his ancient voice carrying directly into the chamber for the full family to hear, that your daughter possesses genuine potential to develop her own draconic partnership, considerably different from my own bond with her father, but no less significant in its own particular way. This is not dangerous, in the way the old Underworld Council once feared my own power within Issei represented danger. It is simply rare, and it will require careful, patient guidance to help her understand and properly develop. Vesper, present for the family council session with the same thoughtful attention she brought to every significant conversation about her own continued growth, absorbed this information with visible, careful consideration before finally speaking. Will this power be like Papa's? She asked. The boosted gear, and everything that came with it. Not precisely, Drake said gently. Your father's bond with me came through inheritance of an ancient sacred gear, a specific, defined vessel for draconic power passed down through considerable generations. What you are developing is something closer to what the old dragon kings themselves once possessed, direct resonance with draconic power itself, rather than power channeled through any single, specific vessel. It is rarer, in some ways, than even your father's remarkable inheritance, though I want to be clear that rarity does not mean danger. It simply means we will need to proceed with particular care, as we help you understand exactly what this resonance means for your own continued development. Issei, watching his daughter process this remarkable revelation with the same careful maturity that had defined so much of her recent growth, found himself reflecting, with quiet, complicated emotion, on how completely different her own path toward understanding draconic power would prove from his own desperate, isolated journey years earlier. You will not face this alone, the way I once did, he told her softly. I awakened to the boosted gear's power with almost no guidance, no understanding of what I carried until crisis forced me to learn quickly and imperfectly. You have an entire fortress of accumulated wisdom, and Drake's own considerable experience, and both your parents' complete, unwavering support, to help you understand this gift properly, patiently, without the kind of desperate crisis that once forced my own understanding. Chapter 88. The careful process of helping Vesper understand and develop her emerging draconic resonance unfolded over the following months with a patience and structure that stood in deliberate, thoughtful contrast to Issei's own chaotic early experience with the boosted gear's power, Drake himself taking direct, active interest in guiding his own former partner's daughter through an awakening he clearly recognized as carrying particular personal significance. I have waited considerable centuries to witness genuine draconic resonance develop naturally, rather than through the more common path of sacred gear inheritance, the ancient dragon explained, during one of their early training sessions within the deep chamber where Ryanair had once lain dying so many years earlier. The same ancient chamber now serving a considerably more hopeful purpose in guiding a new generation's careful growth. This connection you carry, Vesper, exists closer to the old ways, before the current factional order's sacred gear system became the primary vessel for draconic power in this world. I intend to guide you toward understanding it properly, the way a dragon king's own true heir might once have been trained, long before the current world's careful structures existed. Vesper's training, blending Drake's own ancient guidance with careful, practical instruction from both her parents and the Academy's considerable resources, proceeded with a measured patience that honored both her continued education and the genuine responsibility her emerging power represented, and Issei found himself, watching his daughter's careful, steady progress, increasingly struck by how naturally she seemed to absorb lessons that had once cost him considerable struggle and near catastrophic loss of control to learn himself. She approaches this with a wisdom I did not possess at her age, he observed to Ryanair one evening, watching Vesper practice careful meditation technique within the training yard, small tendrils of silver draconic energy, distinct from the crimson that had always marked his own boosted gear power, beginning to manifest gently around her hands under Drake's watchful, patient guidance. I nearly lost myself entirely to the juggernaut drive's uncontrolled fury before I finally learned genuine control. She seems to understand, almost instinctively, exactly the kind of patient discipline that took me years of crisis to fully grasp. Perhaps that is simply the difference between learning something through desperate crisis and learning it through patient, supported guidance, Ryanair observed gently. You had to discover control through trial and considerable error, often at genuine risk to yourself and everyone around you. Vesper has the luxury of learning it carefully, surrounded by people who love her and have every incentive to help her develop wisely, rather than being forced to discover it alone under desperate, dangerous circumstances. As the months progressed and Vesper's careful control over her emerging draconic resonance continued steadily developing, Drake offered a reflection, during one particularly significant training session, that Issei recognized, immediately, as carrying weight considerably beyond simple instructional guidance. I have partnered with your father across 16 remarkable years, the dragon told Vesper, his ancient voice carrying genuine, unmistakable warmth. I did not expect, in all my considerable centuries of existence, to find myself similarly invested in guiding his daughter's own path toward understanding draconic power. But watching you these past months, Vesper, I find myself experiencing something I do not believe I have felt in all my long existence. Genuine hope, that this world's next generation might inherit power guided by wisdom and patience, rather than forged, as your father's own path once was, through desperate grief and painful isolation. Chapter 89. The first genuine test of Vesper's developing draconic resonance arrived not through any dramatic, orchestrated crisis, but through an ordinary, unexpected accident that occurred during one of the satellite settlement's routine infrastructure projects, a section of newly constructed housing collapsing suddenly during a violent, unseasonal storm that swept across the wastes with little warning, trapping several residents beneath considerable rubble. Vesper, present at the settlement alongside Asia's healing division for a scheduled training visit when the collapse occurred, found herself thrust immediately into genuine crisis, her careful months of patient, supported training suddenly facing the kind of real, urgent test that no amount of controlled practice could fully replicate. I need help clearing this section, she called out, her voice carrying a steady, focused clarity that belied her genuine fear, as she worked alongside settlement residents to assess the trapped victim's condition. The structure is unstable. If we move too quickly without proper support, we risk further collapse. Asia, arriving quickly at the scene alongside the settlement's own emergency response team, recognized immediately the particular danger of the situation, structural collapse considerably beyond what conventional magic or manual labor alone could safely address without risking further harm to those already trapped. Vesper, she said carefully, understanding exactly what she was asking even as she spoke, can your draconic resonance help stabilize the structure while we work to free the trapped residents? Vesper felt a moment of genuine, understandable fear at the request, months of careful, controlled training suddenly facing a test with real stakes considerably beyond anything her patient practice had previously demanded. But she thought, in that critical moment, of everything Drake had taught her across months of patient guidance, and of her father's own example, choosing purpose over fear during his own most desperate confrontations. I will try, she said, closing her eyes briefly to center herself the way Drake had carefully taught her, silver draconic energy beginning to flow from her hands with a focused, deliberate control that reflected months of patient discipline rather than desperate, uncontrolled panic. The silver energy, spreading carefully across the collapsed structure's unstable sections, provided exactly the stabilizing support the emergency response team needed, holding the damaged framework steady long enough for careful, coordinated rescue efforts to free every trapped resident without further injury or collapse. By the time the crisis had fully resolved, Vesper found herself exhausted but genuinely proud, understanding, with quiet, profound clarity, that her careful months of patient training had prepared her, precisely as intended, for exactly this kind of genuine, meaningful contribution. Chapter 90. Word of Vesper's successful intervention reached the central fortress within hours, and Issei, receiving the report through the crystal array network that had carried so many significant messages across the years, felt a complicated mixture of profound pride and genuine, lingering parental fear settle through him in equal measure. She is safe, Ryanair confirmed, having received her own separate report through her continued connections within the Fallen Angel Corps, her voice carrying visible relief even as concern remained evident beneath it. But Issei, she used her draconic resonance in a genuine crisis, without either of us present to guide or support her directly. I know we always understood this day would eventually arrive, but I confess I am not certain I feel fully prepared for it, regardless of how much careful training we provided beforehand. Issei considered his wife's words carefully, recognizing in them an echo of his own complicated feelings, and found himself, in that reflective moment, thinking back to his own desperate, unsupported confrontations across his early years building the sovereignty, the particular loneliness of facing genuine danger without any accumulated wisdom or careful preparation to guide him. I think, he said slowly, this is precisely what all those months of careful, patient training were meant to prepare her for. Not simply controlled practice within safe, supervised settings, but genuine confidence to act wisely and effectively when real crisis actually arrives, exactly as it did today. I am proud of her, Ryanair, more than I think I have adequate words to fully express. And yes, I am also frightened, the way I suspect every parent feels the first time their child faces genuine danger and rises to meet it capably. When Vesper finally returned to the central fortress the following day, exhausted but carrying herself with the particular quiet confidence of someone who had proven, decisively, her own genuine capability, Issei found himself greeting her with an embrace that carried considerable, complicated emotion. I am so proud of you, he said softly, holding his daughter close. And I confess I am also considerably more frightened than I anticipated feeling, watching you face genuine danger without either of us there to help directly. I was frightened too, Papa, Vesper admitted, her voice carrying honest, unguarded vulnerability beneath her evident pride. But I remembered everything Drake taught me, and everything you have shown me, across your own story, about choosing purpose over fear when it genuinely matters. I do not think I could have managed it without everything this family, and this fortress have already taught me. Drake's ancient presence, stirring warmly within Issei's chest as he listened to the exchange, offered his own reflection with evident, unmistakable pride. She handled herself with genuine wisdom, partner, the dragon said. Controlled, focused, thinking clearly about the structural stability required rather than simply reacting with raw, uncontrolled power. That is precisely the kind of mastery it took you years of desperate crisis to develop. She achieved it, through patient guidance, in a matter of months. Chapter 91. The Settlement Collapse Incident. while ultimately resolved without serious injury thanks to Vesper's timely intervention, prompted the council to consider more formally how her emerging draconic resonance might be integrated into the sovereignty's broader structure, a conversation that Issei approached with the same careful balance he had maintained throughout his daughter's entire development, honoring her genuine capability while remaining vigilant against placing undue pressure or expectation on someone still genuinely a child navigating remarkable, rare circumstances. I do not want her role within this sovereignty defined entirely by what her power can provide, he told the council during a session specifically addressing the question. That was precisely the mistake the old Gremory peerage made with me, valuing my contribution primarily for my usefulness rather than genuinely valuing me as a person first. I will not allow the same mistake to shape my own daughter's continued growth, regardless of how remarkable her emerging abilities may prove. Elena, listening to Issei's careful concern with evident understanding, offered a perspective that helped shape the council's eventual, careful approach. Perhaps the solution is simply ensuring Vesper herself retains full agency over how, and whether, her abilities factor into any formal role, she suggested. She has already demonstrated remarkable wisdom in choosing to help during the settlement crisis, entirely of her own initiative, rather than through any formal obligation or expectation. Perhaps our task is simply supporting whatever choices she continues to make, rather than defining a structured role that might inadvertently pressure her toward using her abilities in ways she has not genuinely chosen herself. The council ultimately adopted exactly this approach, formally establishing that Vesper's continued involvement with Asia's healing division and any broader application of her developing draconic resonance would remain entirely her own choice, offered without formal expectation or structured obligation, honoring the same fundamental principle of freely chosen contribution that had defined the sovereignty's entire remarkable history. Vesper, informed of the council's careful decision, offered her own reflection that Issei recognized, immediately, as demonstrating exactly the kind of wisdom he had hoped, across years of careful, patient parenting, she might eventually develop. I understand why this matters to you, Papa, she told him, during a quiet evening conversation following the council's decision. I have read the full historical record now, remember. I understand exactly what it felt like, being valued primarily for what you could offer rather than for who you genuinely were. I promise you, I do not feel pressured by my own abilities. I choose to help because I genuinely want to, the same way everyone within this fortress chooses their own particular contribution freely. That choice belongs entirely to me, and I am deeply grateful that you and Mother have always made sure I understood that distinction clearly. Issei felt profound, quiet gratitude at his daughter's thoughtful reassurance, understanding, with sudden clarity, that the careful, patient parenting he and Rianer had provided across 16 remarkable years had produced exactly the kind of genuine wisdom he had always hoped his daughter might eventually carry forward into whatever future still awaited her. Then I am simply proud of you, he said softly. Not for what your power can provide this sovereignty, though I confess I am considerably in awe of what you have already accomplished. Proud of who you are becoming, thoughtfully and genuinely, one careful choice at a time. Chapter 92. In the weeks following the Council's formal decision regarding Vesper's continued agency over her own developing abilities, Asia found herself reflecting, during a quiet conversation with Issei within the Academy's healing wing, on how completely the young girl's careful, principled approach to her own remarkable gifts mirrored lessons Asia herself had once struggled considerably to learn. I remember believing, during my own years within the Gremory peerage, that my worth depended entirely on my usefulness as a healer, she admitted. I healed because I believed that was the price of belonging, not because I had genuinely chosen it freely for its own sake. Watching Vesper approach her own abilities so differently, understanding clearly that her contribution springs from genuine choice rather than obligation, I find myself recognizing exactly how much healthier her relationship with her own power already is, compared to where my own understanding stood at her age. Issei listened to Asia's reflection with quiet, considered appreciation, recognizing in her words another thread of the same fundamental principle that had guided the sovereignty's entire remarkable development. I think that distinction, between obligation and genuine choice, remains the single most important lesson this entire community continues teaching, generation after generation, he said. We are not always successful at it. But when we succeed, exactly as we have with Vesper, the results speak considerably more powerfully than any formal policy or careful structure could achieve alone. Asia nodded slowly, her own expression carrying the particular warmth of someone who had, across her own years within the sovereignty, fully reclaimed the healthy relationship with purpose and contribution that her earlier years had once denied her. I am deeply grateful, she said softly, to have found my way here, and to have found, within these walls, the opportunity to finally understand what genuine, freely chosen contribution actually feels like, rather than the anxious obligation I once mistook for purpose. Chapter 93. Surzex's announcement, delivered personally during a formal visit to the fortress as the sovereignty's 17th year began settling into its familiar, steady rhythm, carried a weight that Issei recognized, immediately, as representing a genuine turning point in the Underworld's own continued governance, one that echoed, in its own particular way, the same careful, patient succession planning that had begun quietly shaping conversations within the sovereignty's own council regarding Vesper's eventual, gradual inheritance of responsibility. I have begun considering my own succession, Surzex admitted, addressing Issei directly during a private conversation within the familiar war chamber that had witnessed so many significant discussions across their 17 years of deepening friendship and alliance. I have governed the Underworld for considerably longer than any single leader perhaps should, across centuries of careful, sometimes overly cautious stewardship. Watching what you have built here, and now watching your own daughter beginning to develop her own particular gifts and her own particular wisdom, I find myself increasingly convinced that healthy institutions require genuine renewal, rather than simply continuous, unchanging leadership indefinitely. Issei listened carefully, recognizing in Surzex's reflection considerable personal weight beyond simple political strategy. Who do you have in mind? He asked gently, understanding the question's genuine sensitivity even as he asked it. Issei considered this for a long moment before answering, choosing his words with visible, considered care. Rias, he finally said. She has spent considerable years since her own difficult reckoning with the decision that led to your exile, working to rebuild not simply her own standing, but genuine wisdom about exactly the kind of leadership our house, and perhaps our entire faction, genuinely requires going forward. I believe, watching her continued growth across these years, that she may be more ready than either of us once believed possible. Issei felt complicated, genuine emotion at this revelation, understanding, with quiet reflection, exactly how completely his own relationship with Rias had evolved across 17 years since that painful throne room confrontation, from raw betrayal through careful, difficult reconciliation towards something that now felt, increasingly, like genuine peace. I believe that decision belongs entirely to you and your own counsel, he said carefully. But if you are asking my own perspective, having witnessed her genuine transformation across these years myself, I believe she has learned something considerably valuable from everything that happened between us. Whether that makes her genuinely ready for such considerable responsibility, I cannot say with certainty. But I do not believe her past mistakes should permanently disqualify her from the genuine growth she has clearly demonstrated since. Chapter 94. The succession conversation, unfolding gradually across subsequent months within the Underworld's own careful governance structure, brought Rias herself to the fortress for a visit that carried, Issei recognized immediately, considerably different weight than any of their previous, more limited encounters across the years since their original, painful reckoning. I understand my brother has spoken with you about his considerations regarding succession, she said, during a private conversation within the same neutral garden where they had once achieved their initial, careful reconciliation years earlier. I wanted to speak with you directly, Issei, both because I respect your judgment considerably more than I once demonstrated I did, and because I believe genuine honesty between us matters more now than it perhaps ever has. Issei studied her carefully, recognizing in her bearing something considerably different from the careful, guarded composure that had once characterized even their most vulnerable previous conversations, a settled confidence that felt, unmistakably, earned rather than simply performed. What would you like to discuss? He asked. I want you to understand exactly what I have learned, across these 17 years, from everything that happened between us, she said. Not simply regret, though I still carry that, genuinely and permanently. Understanding. I valued you once for what your power could provide our house, rather than genuinely valuing you as a person deserving protection regardless of your usefulness. I have spent considerable years since learning to recognize that same mistake in myself, and working, deliberately and carefully, to build a different kind of leadership than the one that led to your exile. Issei felt genuine, complicated respect at her careful, honest reflection, understanding, with quiet clarity, exactly how much personal growth those words represented. What does that different kind of leadership look like, in practice, he asked. Leadership that values people first, and their usefulness only secondarily, she said. I have spent years within my own house's governance, working to build exactly the kind of accountability and genuine care your own sovereignty has always demonstrated, adapted to our own particular circumstances and structure. I do not believe I can build something identical to what you achieved here. But I believe I have learned, genuinely and permanently, exactly why what you built here matters so profoundly, and I hope to carry that understanding forward, if my brother's council ultimately decides I am ready for the responsibility he is considering. Issei considered her words carefully, recognizing, with quiet, genuine satisfaction, that the woman before him now bore only distant resemblance to the calculating figure who had once condemned him with the council's cold vocabulary in that painful throne-room confrontation so many years earlier. I believe you have learned that lesson, he said finally. Genuinely, and at considerable personal cost. Whatever your brother's council ultimately decides, I want you to know that I no longer carry the anger I once held toward you, Rias. I have not for many years now. I believe, watching your continued growth across this considerable time, that you have earned genuine peace, regardless of whatever position you ultimately hold within your own house's governance. Rias's eyes glistened with genuine emotion at his words, and for a long moment, standing together in the same neutral garden where their reconciliation had first tentatively begun years earlier, both of them simply allowed the weight of 17 years' considerable distance to settle into something that finally, genuinely, felt like complete resolution. Chapter 95. The Underworld Council's eventual decision, formally announced several months after Rias's visit to the fortress, confirmed her as Xerxes' chosen successor, a transition that would unfold gradually over subsequent years as she assumed increasing responsibility within the Underworld's governance structure, and Issei found himself, watching the formal announcement through the Crystal Array network, reflecting on how completely the strange, remarkable arc of his relationship with the Gremory house had ultimately traveled. I never imagined, watching that throne room's silence answer my single question so many years ago, that I would one day feel genuine hope watching Rias assume greater leadership responsibility, he told Ryanair that evening, as they discussed the considerable news together on the familiar battlements. But I do genuinely. I believe she has learned exactly the lesson that mattered most, and I believe the Underworld will be considerably better governed for her having learned it so thoroughly. Ryanair, listening to her husband's reflection with the same thoughtful attention she brought to every significant conversation across their partnership, offered her own perspective with quiet, genuine warmth. I think that speaks to something remarkable about you, Issei, she said. Not simply that you have forgiven her, though that alone required considerable grace. That you can genuinely celebrate her growth, rather than simply tolerating it from careful, guarded distance. That is not a small thing, after everything that happened between you both. Vesper, present for the conversation with the same thoughtful attention she now brought to every significant discussion about the sovereignty's broader political landscape, offered her own observation that Issei recognized, immediately, as reflecting the deepening wisdom her careful study of the full historical record had continued cultivating. I think that is what the entire historical record ultimately teaches, more than any single lesson, she said. People can genuinely change, if they are given honest opportunity and genuine accountability, rather than simply permanent condemnation. Rias made a terrible mistake, 17 years ago. But she also spent those 17 years genuinely working to understand and correct that mistake, rather than simply defending it or ignoring its consequences. I think that distinction matters enormously, Papa. Perhaps as much as anything else this sovereignty has ever demonstrated. Issei felt profound, quiet pride at his daughter's thoughtful reflection, understanding, with sudden clarity, exactly how completely her own developing wisdom continued to mirror and extend everything he and Ryanair had spent 17 years carefully cultivating within their remarkable family and community. You understand something many people spend entire lifetimes failing to grasp, he told her softly. That genuine accountability and genuine forgiveness are not opposites, working against each other. They are partners, each one making the other considerably more meaningful and more possible. I am deeply proud of the wisdom you continue to demonstrate, Vesper, in ways that consistently surprise and humble me. Chapter 96. Rias's gradual assumption of increasing responsibility within the Underworld's governance, unfolding carefully over the following 2 years alongside Surzex's own steady, deliberate transition toward eventual retirement from direct leadership, brought with it a natural deepening of the Concord's own continued collaboration, Rias herself, in her expanding role, becoming an increasingly frequent presence at coalition sessions that Issei found himself navigating with a comfort and genuine warmth that would have seemed entirely impossible during the difficult early years following his exile. I confess, Rias admitted, during one particularly productive Concord session focused on expanding the Academy's cross-factional training programs, I did not fully anticipate how naturally collaborative these sessions would eventually feel. I remember, years ago, believing genuine cooperation across our old, separate structures represented an idealistic aspiration rather than practical, achievable governance. Watching the Concord's continued success has taught me otherwise, considerably more thoroughly than any single conversation could have accomplished alone. Issei, listening to her reflection with genuine appreciation for how completely her own understanding had evolved, offered his own observation with quiet, considered warmth. I think that transformation happens gradually, through accumulated practice rather than sudden realization, he said. We did not build genuine trust between our factions through any single grand gesture. We built it through years of small, consistent choices, showing up honestly for each other, session after session, until that accumulated practice became simply how we operated together, rather than something requiring constant, deliberate effort to maintain. The Concord's continued expansion during this period brought several new independent sovereignties into formal partnership with the broader network, communities that had, over the years since the sovereignty's original founding, developed independently but increasingly sought formal connection to the considerable resources and mutual protection the Concord's established structure now provided. Kale, overseeing the network's continued growth with the same careful, thoughtful attention that had characterized his involvement across every phase of the sovereignty's remarkable development, presented the Council with updated figures during one particularly significant session marking the network's considerable expansion. We now coordinate, in some capacity, with 11 independent sovereignties across territories spanning all 3 factions' domains, he reported, addressing the assembled council with evident, quiet satisfaction. Combined with our own central fortress and its 2 original satellite settlements, our network now represents genuine shelter and genuine belonging for considerably more than 3,000 people, each community adapting our founding principles to their own particular circumstances while remaining connected through the Concord's shared framework of mutual support and coordinated protection. Issei felt profound, quiet wonder at these considerable figures, reflecting, not for the first time, on how completely the sovereignty's original, humble founding had grown into something genuinely transformative across the wider world beyond what he could have ever imagined during those first desperate days walking alone into these same wastes. Chapter 97. Vesper's continued development, both of her draconic resonance under Drake's patient, ongoing guidance and of her broader understanding of the sovereignty's considerable political landscape, brought her, as she approached her 16th year, toward a natural transition that Issei and Ryanair had both anticipated with equal parts pride and gentle, protective apprehension. Her gradual assumption of formal responsibility within the fortress's own considerable governance structure. I would like to formally join the council, she told her parents during a quiet family conversation on the familiar battlements, her request carrying the same thoughtful maturity that had characterized every significant step of her continued growth. Not simply observing sessions, the way I have for years now, but genuinely contributing, representing the perspective of the generation that has grown up within these walls rather than finding our way here through exile or crisis. Issei felt considerable, complicated emotion at his daughter's request, recognizing in it both genuine pride at her evident readiness and the particular, bittersweet awareness that her continued growth carried her steadily further from the small, dependent child he still, some part of him, remembered so vividly. "I believe you would bring genuine, valuable perspective to the council," he said carefully. "But I want to make certain this is genuinely your own choice, Vesper, rather than something you feel obligated to pursue because of your particular heritage or your developing abilities." "It is entirely my own choice, Papa," she assured him, her storm-colored eyes carrying the same fierce, determined clarity that had defined so many of her significant decisions across her continued growth. "I have watched this council navigate crisis after crisis, and steady, patient governance between those crises, for my entire life. I believe I understand, as thoroughly as anyone my age reasonably could, exactly what genuine, accountable leadership requires. I want to contribute that understanding formally, not simply observe it from the periphery any longer." The Council's formal welcome of Vesper as its newest member, ratified during a session that carried particular, quiet significance for the entire assembled group, marked a genuine milestone in the sovereignty's continued evolution, the first member of the generation born within its walls now formally joining the governance structure that had shaped her entire remarkable upbringing. Donasek, offering his own reflection during the same session, spoke to the significance of her inclusion from a perspective shaped by his own years of steady, dedicated service to the fortress's defensive structure. "I have watched this young woman grow from an infant carried in her mother's arms into someone genuinely capable of contributing wisdom to decisions that shape our entire community's future," he observed. "That transformation, more than any single crisis we have overcome together, feels like the truest measure of everything we have built here across these years." Elena, offering the council's formal welcome with evident, genuine warmth, spoke to the significance of the moment with characteristic thoughtful clarity. "We have spent 17 years building something we hoped would genuinely outlast any single generation's direct leadership," she said, addressing the assembled council and Vesper herself with careful, considered reflection. "Today, watching the first child raised entirely within this sovereignty's principles formally join our governance, I believe we are witnessing genuine confirmation that our hope has become reality. This sovereignty was never meant to belong to a single generation. It was always meant to grow, and adapt, and continue forward, carried by exactly the kind of thoughtful, principled leadership Vesper has already demonstrated across her entire remarkable young life." Chapter 98. Vesper's early contributions to the Council, unfolding across the following months with the same careful, thoughtful engagement that had characterized her entire approach to the sovereignty's considerable legacy, brought a particular, valuable perspective that Issei found himself genuinely appreciating: his daughter's unique position as someone who had never known exile or crisis firsthand, yet who understood, through careful study and patient reflection, exactly what those difficult experiences had ultimately built. "I think we sometimes forget," she observed during one council session focused on the Academy's continued curriculum development, "how different the experience feels for students who grew up entirely within this sovereignty's principles, compared to those who arrived here as adults already carrying considerable trauma from the old order's rejection. Both perspectives matter enormously. But I believe our curriculum could benefit from more deliberately incorporating the experience of those of us who never knew anything but belonging, alongside the wisdom of those who had to discover it painfully, later in life." Elena, recognizing immediately the genuine insight behind Vesper's observation, encouraged her to develop the idea further, and the resulting curriculum adjustment, incorporating perspectives from both the founding generation's hard-won wisdom and the younger generation's inherited, native understanding of belonging, ultimately became one of the Academy's most celebrated innovations in the years that followed. It was during this same period that Issei found himself reflecting, with increasing frequency, on the particular, remarkable nature of watching his own daughter contribute genuine, valuable wisdom to a sovereignty he had once believed only his own difficult journey could have possibly built. "I used to believe this fortress's entire foundation rested on the particular pain of exile," he reflected to Ryanair one evening, watching Vesper engage thoughtfully with the council session's considerable, complex deliberations from across the war chamber. "Watching Vesper's contributions, I understand now that was never entirely accurate. The pain of exile built the fortress's original walls, certainly. But what makes it genuinely lasting is exactly what Vesper represents, an entire generation who inherited belonging rather than having to fight desperately for it, and who now carry that inherited gift forward with genuine wisdom of their own. Ryanair, watching their daughter with the same quiet, profound pride that had characterized so much of her own reflection across Vesper's remarkable growth, offered her own observation with gentle, considered warmth. "I think that is precisely what you always hoped this sovereignty would become," she said softly. "Not simply a shelter for the discarded, though it will always remain that. A genuine, lasting culture, capable of raising children who understand belonging as their birthright rather than something desperately earned through survival and sacrifice. Vesper's proof, Issei, walking, breathing proof, that everything you built from that first desperate night has become exactly what you always hoped it might." Chapter 99. The 18th year brought with it a quieter, more personal milestone that Issei found himself approaching with particular, complicated tenderness, Vesper's continued growth having reached a point where conversations about her own eventual path beyond the fortress, whether toward independent contribution within the wider Concord network, or towards some entirely different future she might choose for herself, began arising naturally within their family's ongoing reflection. It was during this same period that Ves, whose own transformation within the fortress had continued steadily deepening across the years since her original defection, approached Issei with an observation that carried, he recognized immediately, considerable personal significance for her own continued journey. "I have been watching Vesper's growth with particular interest," she admitted, during a quiet conversation within the war chamber's familiar walls. "I never had children of my own, given the particular circumstances of my years within the remnant. Watching her grow into such genuine, thoughtful wisdom, I find myself understanding something about what this sovereignty ultimately offers that I did not fully grasp even after years of living here myself. Not simply shelter for those who arrive already wounded. Genuine cultivation of an entirely new way of understanding belonging, passed forward to a generation who never had to learn it through painful necessity." Issei considered her reflection carefully, recognizing in it the same thoughtful maturity that had characterized Ves's entire journey since her original, courageous defection. "I think that is precisely what makes watching her grow so meaningful to me as well," he said. "I built this fortress from grief and desperate necessity. Watching Vesper inherit its principles without that same painful cost, and then watching her carry those principles forward with genuine wisdom of her own, feels like the truest possible vindication of everything those difficult early years were ultimately building toward. I have been thinking about the Eastern settlement," Vesper told her parents during a quiet evening conversation, her expression carrying the particular thoughtfulness that had come to define so much of her continued maturation. "They have requested additional support developing their own healing division, drawing on Asia's model here. I would like to spend some time there, contributing directly, rather than simply advising from a distance the way I have with several other communities within our network." Issei felt the familiar, complicated mixture of pride and gentle, protective concern that had accompanied nearly every significant step of his daughter's continued independence, understanding, even as those feelings arose, that honoring her genuine agency mattered more than indulging his own natural parental hesitation. "How long are you considering?" he asked carefully. "Perhaps a full season," she said. "Long enough to genuinely help establish their program properly, rather than simply offering brief, surface-level guidance before returning here. I want to understand, firsthand, what it means to contribute meaningfully to a community beyond the one that raised me, the same way you once had to build everything here from genuine scratch, without the accumulated wisdom of an existing structure to draw upon." Ryanair, listening to her daughter's thoughtful request with the same careful consideration Issei was working through himself, offered her own reflection with gentle, considered warmth. "I think that represents genuine wisdom," she said. "Understanding a system by helping build it, rather than simply inheriting its finished structure. I remember, watching you grow up entirely within this fortress's established principles, wondering whether you would ever have the opportunity to genuinely test and apply those principles somewhere they had not already been proven. This feels like precisely that opportunity, offered on your own terms and through your own genuine choice." The decision, discussed carefully across several subsequent family conversations, ultimately received both parents' full, genuine support, and Vesper's departure for the Eastern settlement, several weeks later, carried a particular, bittersweet significance that Issei found himself processing with considerable, complicated emotion even as he recognized, fully, the genuine rightness of his daughter's chosen path. Chapter 100. Vesper season within the Eastern settlement, unfolding across several months that brought regular but not constant communication back to the central fortress, revealed, through her careful, detailed reports, a young woman genuinely coming into her own particular strength and wisdom, considerably beyond even the thoughtful maturity she had already demonstrated across her continued growth within the central fortress's more established, supportive structure. I did not fully understand, until arriving here, exactly how much accumulated support I had always taken for granted within our own fortress, she wrote, in one particularly reflective message relayed through the Crystal Array network. Here, I do not have Asia's immediate guidance, or Drake's constant, patient wisdom readily available. I have had to trust my own judgment, genuinely and completely, in ways I have not previously needed to. It is frightening some days. But it is also, I am discovering, exactly the kind of growth I believe I needed, to genuinely understand everything you and Mother built, rather than simply inheriting its finished structure without ever testing my own capability to build something similar myself. Issei, reading his daughter's thoughtful reflection with considerable, quiet pride, found himself recalling his own early days building the original fortress, the particular terror and exhilaration of genuine, unsupported responsibility that had ultimately forged everything the sovereignty had since become. She is learning exactly what I learned, all those years ago, he told Rias, sharing the message's contents during one of their own quiet evening conversations. Not through desperate crisis, the way I once did, but through genuine, chosen challenge. I believe this season away will prove considerably formative for her continued development, in ways that even our most careful, patient guidance here could never quite replicate. The Eastern Settlement's Healing Division, established under Vesper's careful, dedicated guidance across her season of direct involvement, ultimately became a genuine, lasting success, drawing on Asia's original model while adapting thoughtfully to the settlement's own particular circumstances and needs. And when Vesper finally returned to the central fortress as autumn settled once more over the wastes, Issei found himself greeting a daughter who carried herself with a settled, hard-won confidence that felt, unmistakably, considerably deepened from the thoughtful but still somewhat sheltered young woman who had departed several months earlier. I understand something now that I do not believe I could have learned any other way, she told her parents, during their first quiet family evening following her return. Everything you built here, Papa, was never simply given to you. You had to discover it, choice by difficult choice, through genuine uncertainty and genuine risk. I have only now begun to understand firsthand exactly what that kind of genuine, uncertain building actually requires. I am deeply grateful for everything you and Mother provided me here, growing up. But I am equally grateful, now, to have finally tested my own capability to build something meaningful without that accumulated support constantly available. Chapter 101. The sovereignty's 20th year arrived with a quality of accumulated, hard-won significance that Issei found himself approaching with particular, reflective attention, the milestone carrying weight considerably beyond simple calendar arithmetic, representing instead 2 full decades since that first desperate night walking alone into these same wastes with nothing left but grief and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. The formal celebration marking the occasion, considerably larger even than the decade convocation a full decade earlier, drew representatives from across the Concord's entire, considerable network, delegates from all 3 factions and every one of the now 14 independent sovereignties that had grown, over 20 years, from the original fortress's patient, careful example, standing once more on the familiar battlements as the celebration's formal proceedings concluded and the gathering settled into its considerably more relaxed, joyful evening atmosphere. Issei found Rias and Vesper joining him, the 3 of them watching the fortress lights burn warm and steady against the settling twilight, joined now by the considerable, distant glow of an entire network of communities scattered across a horizon that had once held nothing but empty, unclaimed waste. 20 years, he said quietly, the words carrying the full, accumulated weight of everything those 2 decades had ultimately built. I still find myself surprised, even now, by how far this road has traveled since that first desperate night. Vesper, now approaching 18 years and carrying herself with the settled, hard-won confidence her season within the Eastern settlement had helped further cultivate, offered her own reflection with the particular clarity that had come to define her continued, remarkable maturation. "I think," she said softly, "that surprise never fully fades, Papa, no matter how many years accumulate. I have grown up entirely within everything you and Mother built, and I still find myself surprised, regularly, by exactly how remarkable this sovereignty has become. Perhaps that ongoing surprise is simply what it feels like, to be part of something genuinely still growing, rather than something finished and static." Drake's ancient presence stirred warmly once more in Issei's chest, the dragon's low, contented rumble carrying, after 20 full years of partnership through grief and building and hard-won joy, the particular satisfaction of a being who had witnessed, across considerable centuries of existence, remarkably few stories quite so genuinely remarkable as the one that continued, patiently and steadily, unfolding beneath him on these ancient, familiar battlements. 20 years, partner, the dragon said quietly. "And I believe, watching everything gathered here tonight, an entire network of communities, a daughter carrying forward genuine wisdom of her own, a concord spanning 3 factions that once could not have imagined such genuine, lasting cooperation, that you have already proven, decisively and completely, everything a single stubborn refusal to disappear quietly can ultimately become, given enough patience, enough courage, and enough people willing to build alongside you, one honest, chosen day at a time." Below them, the fortress lights burned steady and warm against the settling twilight, joined by the considerable, distant glow of an entire network of independent sovereignties, each one proof, patient and unfinished and considerably more remarkable than anyone could have imagined from its beginning, that grief, given enough time and enough love, really could become the strongest foundation of all. The sovereignty's 20th year had ended. Its story, carried forward now by a daughter who understood both its cost and its considerable triumph, and by an entire network of communities continuing to grow and adapt across a world that had once insisted such genuine belonging was impossible, continued onward, patient and unfinished, one honest, chosen day at a time, for as long as the road ahead still had left to give. Later that same evening, as the celebration's considerable crowd gradually dispersed toward their own quarters and temporary accommodation scattered across the fortress's expanded grounds, Issei found himself walking the familiar corridors alone for a brief, reflective moment, passing the same ancient gates that had first opened for him 20 years earlier, the towering iron and stone entrance now bearing subtle, careful additions accumulated across 2 decades, small plaques and markers, commemorating significant moments in the sovereignty's remarkable history, each one representing another chapter of the considerable, collective story that had grown from his own original, desperate refusal to disappear quietly. He paused before the gates for a long moment, remembering the particular weight of that first night, the dust sifting from ancient hinges as the fortress opened, and possibly, after 3,000 years of patient waiting, for a boy who had nothing left to offer beyond genuine need and genuine refusal. 20 years, he said quietly, to no one in particular, simply allowing the words their own weight in the quiet, settling evening air. 20 years. And I would not trade a single difficult day of it, not even the grief that started everything, because that grief, in the end, became the foundation for everything I have ever genuinely loved. Drake's ancient presence, quiet but ever present in his chest, offered no verbal response to the reflection, simply a warm, contented pulse that Issei had learned, across 2 decades of partnership, to recognize as the dragon's own particular form of agreement, and together, in comfortable, companionable silence, they turned back toward the fortress's warm, glowing heart, toward Rias and Vesper and the considerable, extended family that continued, patiently and steadily, to grow. Thanks for listening.